call this meeting of the Davenport Community School District Board of Directors to order for this special meeting. And I'm going to turn the meeting over immediately. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going to turn the meeting over immediately to the superintendent after a couple of comments. You may have detected that our Director Gosa is out of town, and we're going to try to have him participate here through a cell phone and through the microphone. I hope it isn't too crazy for all of you. Welcome to everybody. Glad to have you all here. We do, excuse me, this is a format of a committee of the whole meeting, meaning that we will have presenters, which are up here in the front table, and the board will be engaging with discussion with the presenters. And this is being recorded, so it's being recorded, and it will be on the website after it gets vetted or whatever it has to do. I don't understand all that, but it'll be on the website at an appropriate time. So with that, I'll turn the meeting over to Superintendent Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President and Board. Tonight we are here to review the accreditation report from the Department of Education. We're trying to keep this so we get right to the principles that we need to look at. What does it say? How does it affect students? And what are the next steps? I'd like to do introductions of the people who will be making presentations tonight, and start on my left.
Bill Decker, Chief Administrator at the AEA here in Quad Cities.
Arthur Tate, Superintendent.
Stacy Struck, Specialist with the Department of Special Education for Davenport Schools.
Patty Pace-Tracy, Director of Special Ed.
Susan Downs, Specialist from the Special Ed Department.
Gus Hallbaker, Specialist from the Special Ed Department.
Kim Hoffman, Special Education Director, Mississippi Bend, AEA.
There are essentially 8 portions of our presentation, and what I'd like to do is after each of the descriptions of the compliance issue to stop and ask questions. So you don't have to wait till the very end. We can get them one at a time because essentially they're different in most cases, and so I think that'd be the best way to do it. So we'll stop between each one. So we'll start with Patty talking about the general overview.
Okay, so as Dr. Tate said, there are 8 areas of noncompliance that the Department of Education found us that we need to address. The first one, and we'll go into more detail as we talk about each of these. The first one is placement decisions for students with disabilities. The second one is providing prior written notice to parents. The third one is disproportionality, and that's broken into 3 areas, and we'll get into the specifics of what each of those areas are as we go through our presentation. The next one is services for students with behavioral needs, and then removals and suspensions for students with disabilities. The next one is evaluation procedures, including initial evaluations, seclusion and restraint as applied to students with disabilities, and then permissible special education expenditures. So those are the areas that we'll talk about. And so we'll go ahead and get started with our first area, which is placement.
I want to put the placement in perspective. The issue of change of placements for elementary special education students began last year as a leadership team helped me formulate my superintendent priorities. At the time, one of my goals was to take actions which would reduce the achievement gap for special education students. That was among, if I recollect, 8 or 9 different goals that I had. During that year, the district was committing itself to an all means all mentality to assure that every student, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, language ability, or special education situation, got the same core instruction as all other students. It was at that time that we put together our collective responsibility statement for the district, which says that every member of the Davenport Community School District team is responsible for the success of all students. My leadership team at the time researched all UEN districts because of their similarities to Davenport and found that Sioux City District realized success in several areas which we were investigating. One of the successes was special education students being co-taught in the elementary classroom setting. The Special Education Department interviewed and conferred with administrators from Sioux City. After much discussion and research, it was determined that the model would work in Davenport. I want to emphasize co-teaching and the regular classroom sprung out of a district initiative which included the Special Education Department. Last week, when we met with the Department of Education team, they lauded us for the intent to place special education students in general education classroom in the least restrictive environment. We erred in the manner in which that was accomplished. There was no intent to leave out parents. They were informed by a letter of change, and we thought we were using the proper process to accomplish that. The Department of Education determined, although the intent was good, it was not the proper procedure. Throughout the year, the co-teaching model was monitored and evaluated, and we did find that in our district, adjustments will have to be made. However, we ascribe to the intent to place students in the least restrictive environment and ensure that they get the core instruction. That premise is the foundation of the multi-tiered system of support, which includes the education of special education students.
Okay, so in looking at this first citation, so we appreciate everything Dr. Tate said about wanting to ensure that we were providing our special education students with the opportunity to participate in CORE. But we did not go about it the way that the Department of Education would have preferred that we go about it. So in relation to this citation on placement decisions, again, we cite what is it, and we've kind of broken each of these slides down into what is it, how does it impact students, and what are our next steps. So regarding the what is it, Dr. Tate, I think, did a very good job of explaining that it was in relation to the multi-tiered system of supports and bringing that in district-wide and including our special education students in that. But we didn't use the right process to accomplish that. We reached out to parents and offered to hold meetings if parents wish to hold meetings, or to not do that. But the offer was made to parents, or was intended to be made to parents. We provided guidance to teachers on how to go about that. The Department of Ed said that we should have provided meetings for all of them, and we offered the option of how we should do that. So with that being said, the Department of Ed said that we did not individualize this attempt at how we moved our students into general education because it was a district initiative. We should have looked individually at every student and their needs and then made a decision accordingly based on that. So we did mess that up. So many of our students, and the information that we've received back from building principals and administrator, is that many of our students, this was a very positive move for them to be involved in Gen Ed. We do have some students, though, that do require more service. And so throughout the course of this school year, because this, of course, is the first year of implementation, we have been holding and convening IEP meetings to address those needs. What are our next steps regarding that? We have been assigned an implementation advisor who oversees the accreditation report and the compliance indicators that we have to remedy. That individual will be meeting with our district this coming week. Am I right on that? Yeah, May 22nd. I was going to say the 23rd, but I think that was right, which is this next week. And so that person will help guide us through how we need to go about remedying this. What we will do is that we will be convening IEP meetings for every student who this impacted, and then holding IEP meetings to determine if we need to do anything more to address their IEP needs. And then there was a large group of students that it was noted there were no issues with the services that they had received, but the Department of Education has indicated that we need to provide a letter to that group and offer IEP meetings if parents wish to hold IEP meetings.
Is that all for that one? Questions?
Yep, that is it for that one.
Director DeSalvo.
When we previously talked about changes in special ed and IEP plans, you mentioned that the state came in and said, we need to put our students, 80% of their day needs to be in with general education students. So that wasn't something the district implemented, that was something the state said we had to do. Is that correct?
Thank you for bringing that up. We had actually, when we were notified of the fact that the state was coming in to do an accreditation visit, at that time when we received that letter, they had noted that according to the data that they had pulled, which was not current year's data, but previous year's data, that we did have too many students in restrictive settings within our school district. And so, yes, so the flip side of that is, had we left our services the way we had been providing them, I can't speculate on if we would have received a compliance citation. I think we probably would have. And so moving them into the general education setting, number one, was to support our MTSS system because they indicated too many of our kids were in restrictive settings. So we needed to go about it in a different manner, and so that's why we're going to fix that now. But you are correct. We had been, that's, the original letter did indicate that.
I think that's it for now. Go ahead.
Director Beck.
I guess, I think I asked this question before, but can you explain how we can have too many students in a particular setting when it's supposed to be an individualized education plan and every student should have an individual setting, and we may have a lot of students who need a lot of extra help?
Great question. And I will explain that we are responsible for certain indicators, and that is one of the indicators that the state does follow regarding how many students are placed in general education 80% or more of their day, how many students are placed in general education up to 40 to 80% of their day, and then how many students are in general education 100% of the day. So we, even with what you're saying is correct, yes, IEPs need to be individualized. We are, though, required to meet certain standards that the state and federal government does set for us. And in this case, they were citing the fact that when they sent the letter to us that they were coming in to do an accreditation visit, that we had one of the highest number of students in restrictive settings within the state. So that was going to be an area of need that we needed to address as well. Is there anything else?
The premise, when we met with the Department of Ed, Dave Tilley had spoke about when a strong system, a multi-tiered system of supports is in place where students are getting the core instruction, tier 2 instruction, which is targeted interventions, and then tier 3 instruction, which is even a heavier dose. There's not as much of a need for students to be pulled out of the classroom because they're getting all of that in the special education classroom. That's why the state looks at that in the general education classroom. Sorry, that's why the state looks at that 80%, because if all the supports are in place, most students should benefit with that type of service.
So I just want to clarify. So the idea is that the MTSS provides enough support that we shouldn't have to have that many students in restrictive environments. Is that
So an MTSS system, the intent of it, and if I misspeak, I would like anybody else to jump in when I'm responding to this. So in a universal core instruction setting, and that's what we talk about with a multi-tiered system of supports, some of the guiding factors that are used within that system is that if 80% of the students in your classroom or in your building should be able to be proficient in core instruction, and then you have an additional 20% of students who are going to require more intensive services, and that would be what Ms. Struck mentioned in relation to tier 2 instruction, which is core instruction plus additional maybe whole group support needed by a large group of students in the classroom. And then there are going to be students who fall out of that require more individualized intensive supports, which we commonly refer to as tier 3 students. And then from that, there should be a smaller number of students then that might not be responding effectively to core tier 2, tier 3 instruction, and those would be the students then that would receive specially designed, if they have an IEP, who would receive specially designed instruction on top of all of those levels. That's why it's referred to as a multi-tiered system. Would anybody like to add anything else to that?
I think I would just, excuse me, add to that it is, as Patty said, there's federal and state indicators that districts have to follow as far as the percentage of time the students have access to the general education curriculum. And so that is all about access, because the research tells us that when students are exposed to a general education curriculum with the right supports in place, as Patty has just described, they will perform better, their outcomes are better. And so really what the whole LRE and percentage issue is about is where students are receiving service, because SDI, which is specially designed instruction, that's what students get access to that a IEP student does not have access to, but that can happen in any setting. So you can receive your special education supports in a general education classroom, or you can receive them in a special education classroom. So it's all about the where and the how of how those supports are delivered as well.
Director Potts?
When you were talking about restricted programming, they were including, the state was including SCI classes, and some of them would be too restricted.
Yes.
Because normally when I think of restricted programming, I think it could be, self-contained, that's.
Yeah, it would be any of the above. Yep.
Next time I do.
Okay. Are you done then?
I am done.
Okay. Director Hayes?
When the students are integrated in the general ed classes, how is that education administered? Is there like one-on-one, or how can you explain that to me?
So across, if you think about it in terms of a K-12 setting, I'll start with our high school and our middle schools. Our core courses, and when I talk about our core courses, I'm referring to our social studies, science, math, and language arts courses. We have co-teachers that are in those classes to help support special education students, and that's in place at the high school, and that's in place at the middle school level, the intermediate level. And when we provided more flexibility at the elementary level for how to deliver services, and so we said that teams needed to decide for students whether it would be more beneficial for a student to receive services from a push-in model, where the special ed teacher is in the general education classroom for their specially designed instruction, or in a pull-out model. So it varies depending on the student, and it varies depending on what's been identified for the needs of the student. So to say that it's one way or it's all this way or it's all that way, we can't speak to that. It really is decided at the building level based on the needs of the students and what's going to most effectively support the child.
Anybody else? Director Mayfield?
I guess one of my concerns, because I hear you talking about the tier levels 1, 2, and 3, and I know that we're mandated by the state to integrate as well as we can. What concerns me there is when we have a child that is definitely not able to integrate as far as abilities. And I know you may have one teacher. What's the ratio of kids in a class, typical class, that are the extremes, meaning tier 1, tier 3? And I think it definitely makes a difference with those kids that are struggling, what type of setting they're put in, because they look at themselves compared to others. And I understand the exposure of those that are higher ability will help elevate those supposedly that are lower ability, unless they're missing too many of the tools. So my question is, how has that affected the kids as far as their achievement? And I'm talking about achievement on both levels. I'm talking about the higher ability kids as well as the lower ability kids. And how are we measuring that? How effective are we being in being able to see the cause and effect of what it's doing? I was told that, or should I say I've been read, that many times kids are a little bit more disruptive when they can't do the work. On the other side, there are kids that are disruptive whether they can do the work or not. But again, what's the relationship as far as those that are in tier 1 and tier 3 as to their actually being able to keep up or being affected by it?
So I'm going to do my best at answering this without being able to speak to any data specifically. The district does collect universal screening data 3 times a year in relation to math and reading data. And so we would have to review that data to really look at how students are doing in each, you can drill down to each teacher, each classroom, each building, et cetera. What I will say is that many students in a general education setting, and those even who are not identified as a special education student with an IEP, many students require additional Tier 2 instruction, and then fewer students may still require additional Tier 3 instruction. So I don't know that I could say, and I'm only providing you now with my opinion, that special ed students necessarily are going to stand out per se, and be unique to their peers in those classrooms. I think there are other students who are even not identified as requiring an IEP who exhibit a number of those needs that you just mentioned in relation to the different tiers. We, of course, can look at our universal screening data to determine how individual students are doing and to determine how classrooms are performing, and that's looking at all kids. So we can do those things. I will tell you that our building teams are very, very good when they have a student who is not responding effectively or is not responding well to the Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 instruction. And I'm talking now, I'm talking either special ed students or even gen ed students. Our building teams work really hard and are doing a really good job of identifying those kids that they believe need additional support and additional work. All of our buildings, and you've probably heard this in presentations, have the collaborative teacher teams that are meeting on a regular basis with the intent of looking at instruction in the classroom. They also have the student intervention team meetings, and they're meeting on a regular basis to specifically address individual students that they're concerned about. So those meetings are happening in buildings by teachers and by teacher teams. So I really do believe if our buildings do have concerns about students, they are bringing them forward and they're discussing them and then saying, what are our next steps? Do we need to look at other options for kids? Do we need to convene IEP meetings? I believe they're doing those things. Does anybody want to add?
I might just add that my understanding of one of the pillars of the district is properly implemented, robust MTSS system, and that multi-tiered system of support is what we've talked about here, the placement needing to support students that have an IEP. But an MTSS system does affect all students, and it affects students from a deficit position, but also from an accelerated position. And so truly giving support to students that are accelerated is just as important as the deficit side of it, and that can be IEP kids on either end of that spectrum just as much as it can be non-IEP kids on either end of the spectrum. And so when the point that is up there under how did this impact students, most students benefited positively. The state has said this is a good thing. This is the right thing for students to be exposed to a proper MTSS system where, again, it can impact students at all ends of the spectrum. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. The state said this is a good thing. As an AEA, we certainly support this as a good thing. It's more about how is it implemented and what's the process of what we do next. But getting kids into an MTSS system that works, there's a lot of data in the Davenport district about that's working where it's been implemented well.
Thank
you. Director DeSalvo.
Patty, you said that IEP meetings will be held for those IEP students that had impacts.
Yes.
Do you have any idea how are you going to determine who had impacts and who didn't?
So the state provided us with a preliminary list, and it was a very lofty and robust list of student names, and that actually can go into our next slide, which I'm going to pull up. Whoopsie. Oh, here we go. I apologize. I skipped the slide. Sorry about that. And so when the accreditation report came out, and the state noted that we were going to have to convene approximately 2,200 IEPs. Now, that is not just directly related to placement decisions. That number that they provided to us was in relation to other citations, which we're going to talk about here tonight. What we've done is we've actually gone through that list because there were a number of situations where student names were duplicated. I wrote down a number of reasons. So when we went through the list, we narrowed it down to approximately 1,600 students. Now, I want to say up front, this has not been confirmed by the Department of Ed. When we meet next week with the implementation advisor, we'll be going through the list to ensure that we have our numbers correct. But when we went through and actually ferreted out all of the students who should not be on the list, it came down to approximately 1,600 names. Some of the reasons why we took names off the list, and I'll just read those off. Some of those were speech-only IEPs, and the department said we don't need to include those students. They were on the list. Students who were open enrolled into other districts and have been for years or a number of years, their names were on the list. We took those names off the list. Students who've been tuitioned out of our district to other locations for a number of years, so we haven't provided the services for those kids. Those names came off the list. We had a number of students on the list. Kids have moved out of our district, and they haven't been here, so we had to remove those names from the list as well. We had a few deceased students whose names were still on the list. We had to take them off. Students who've graduated and graduated recently within the last year. Some graduated 3 or 4 years ago. So we had to remove those names from the list. Students who were exited from special education at some point in time. So those names were also removed from the list. We had some that were on there where parents had revoked consent for special ed services. Those names came off the list as well. So our best guess at a first run of this in really trying to clean, and then we had duplicate names listed. So we had students listed 2 or 3 times on the list. So our best guess at our first run on trying to clean the list up was that we brought it down to approximately 1,600 students. But this has not been confirmed by the Department of Education. That's where we are at with it. So when we meet with them next week, we will hopefully be able to get that list pared down to just exactly who needs to have an IEP meeting. I noted earlier that one of the requirements were that a number of students didn't require IEP meetings, but we did need to go ahead and send a letter, and if parents wish to hold a meeting. So we'll be doing that as well. That list had originally included approximately close to 900 students, and from narrowing it down to actual students who are still in the district, we narrowed it down to approximately 670 students. But again, I want to emphasize this has not been confirmed with the Department of Ed. So our best guess right now is approximately 1,600 students.
So this list, and I forgive me because I'm just going to throw it out there. Shouldn't we know all the students that are in these programs already? Or I don't understand how someone who had, moved to another district or had been graduated 2 or 3 years ago would still be on a list that we provided to the state.
Do you want to talk about
Sure.
the DE meeting?
So, last week, we had a chance to meet with the Department of Ed, and they pull it just from their system, and they do the best they can, but the way they pull the data, it sometimes has names on our list of students who may have been in our district at one time, but hadn't been removed from the list. So the original list is the list that the Department of Ed sent us from their database.
Which would come from us or anywhere? I'm sorry.
They pulled the list from the web IMS system, which is the information management system through special education, and then they pulled it from the general student database system that the state has, which is where students are downloaded from the district campus system into that. So we talked about the fact that the list doesn't appear to be correct. We spent quite a bit of time trying to narrow it down ourselves, but the Department of Ed has been very clear with us that the list is the list until they have an opportunity to agree or disagree with the names on the list. So we just have to wait until we meet with them in order to really get it down to the students where we need to provide the meetings for.
Can I continue? And then how will we ensure that, so they're going to give us their list, but I hope that we have our own list, and those should be reconciled, and then it should be determined who do we visit with, who needs, what
Yeah.
are our needs at that point.
Nope, you're absolutely correct. We took the list that they provided, and there was the redacted list that was included in the accreditation report. So we went through their list, and then we said, well, this student has not been in the district. This student has moved out of the district. So we based our poll off of going through their list and then going through individual students to figure out if they actually were in the district or not.
Thank you.
You bet.
Director Beck. Well, we got Director Potts also.
Do you anticipate then doing these 1,600 IEPs in addition to the regular annual IEP that takes place with students?
So that's a really good question. What the state has informed us of is that we will need to reconvene IEP meetings as soon as possible. We'll be working with our implementation advisor on how to go about implementing those IEP meetings. We are coming to the end of the school year, so logically those IEP meetings for the most part are going to be held next year for the majority of the students. So our implementation advisor will help us prioritize who we need to focus on first and who we can put out a little bit. So hopefully, a number of them can be convened when it is the students' annual IEP meeting. In many cases, that will not be able to happen, and we'll need to call a special meeting.
Will the students that are currently in programs then be subject to stay put until the IEPs take place?
No, we'll just convene those meetings. The purpose of the meetings is to look at the time frame of October of 2016 to October of 2017. So we will basically be looking at the IEP that occurred during that time to then determine if a student requires what's called compensatory education. So the IEP, we have a list of guiding questions that the DE, we are actually working on some right now where the DE has provided us with questions that we have to ask in order to determine if a student requires what's called compensatory education. The IEP teams are the group who will meet, and then they will go through the list of questions related to that the state has provided to then narrow down and focus on the services that were provided at that time during that time frame to then see if a student requires compensatory education. So it's really at the purview of the IEP team to determine that. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
They won't be in stay put. We'll take a student wherever they're at right now, and then we'll go back and look at the IEP that they had at that time.
Director Beck.
I guess two things. Number one, I understand prioritizing the students who are most impacted, but I know parents whose children have been impacted but maybe wouldn't be prioritized on that list are going to have concerns that they're not being taken care of right away. So is there a reason we can't do things like this over the summer, for example, to sort of speed up implementation?
It's a great question. When we meet next week with the Department of Ed, that is a question that we will pose to our implementation advisor and find out what kind of guidance the DE provides us for that. Absolutely.
Okay, and then my other question is, it's going to take a lot of preparation for IEP teams to be ready for these meetings because they have to be up to date and up to speed. Some of the building teams may not be the same as were in place originally and things like that. Do you guys have sort of a plan for how to make sure everybody's on the same page that's going to be in IEP meetings and sort of adequately prepared so they're not, just reviewing the file right before the meeting or something like that?
Once we meet with our implementation advisor next week and they help provide us with the guidance regarding the process that we have in place right now, and we get feedback from them on what they would like it to look like, we will be meeting with teams to figure that out. Now, how we've done that is at our middle schools and our high schools, we have special education department chairs. So we will meet with all of them and sit down and talk about the process that has to be used. And there are certain steps and forms that we have to use in order to have the compensatory education discussion and convene the IEP meeting. So they'll be prepared to help support the teachers within their buildings to do that. And then at the elementary level, our department has gone out and supported teams until they feel comfortable, because again, there will be a set standard of questions that they'll have to use. So we will be out there supporting those teams until they feel like they're able to take over and handle the meetings. Good question.
Director Hayes.
Yes, Patty, you had mentioned students that were exited out. Can you explain that? Were they just no longer qualifying for the program, or voluntarily, involuntarily? How does that work?
Good question. So students could be found to no longer be eligible for special education services, so they would be exited out. Students who move out of our district aren't exited out of special ed. They're no longer in the district. Some parents elect to revoke consent for special education services, which means they no longer, even though their child qualifies for special ed, they may no longer want special ed. And we call that revocation of consent. And so they've been exited out for that reason. Some students move to homeschooling, and parents do not wish to dual enroll or access special education services. So there could be any number of reasons why a student is exited out.
Okay, and lastly, you mentioned the list, going back to the list. What is the process? How is it updated? We have one set of information, the state has another set of information. How is that kept current? Is it like as soon as a person exits the program, is the system updated, or is it over time? I'm just trying to figure out how these lists are so different with so many different individuals.
No, that's a great question. We have our IMS system, which is the special education IMS system. So anytime a student moves into our district, well, even to start even more broader than that, when students move into our district, then we put them into what is called our campus system. When students register in our district, they go in our campus system. And then if they have an IEP, they also are noted in the what's called the information management system, which is the state IEP system. So that's how students are noted. I can't speak to the data pull from the state and how they generated all of these names of students that we questioned. We just know when we did our original poll, we're like, well, that student hasn't been here in our district for a couple of years. So I can't speak to why the system pulled a number of those names. I think we'll have a clearer understanding next week when we meet with our implementation advisor. We have brought this to their attention, that we are questioning, some of the names on the list that those students, don't appear to be in our district any longer, or were not in our district at the time frame of the poll. And so they're helping us work through that and figure that out. So once we have our implementation advisor, who really will be our link with the Department of Ed, that person will help support us in ensuring that we do have everything correct.
Okay, that does make sense as far as the dual list with two names for campus and also for IEPs, but I'm still questioning some of the others, how they're there.
Right. So we'll get that figured out. Like I said, our implementation advisor should be a nice link for us to help us figure that out.
Okay, thank you.
Good questions.
Director Mayfield.
I guess you were talking about the list has been pared down to 1,600. Where did it start as far as the numbers are concerned? Other question is, I assume there's a date that has to be turned in each year for students that have IEPs. I'm talking about a date where there's a firm set of numbers that you have looked at, how many people have came into the program, the IEPs, how many have left, and then after that is turned into the state. How can there be such a discrepancy if they're getting those numbers from our district? I'm not talking about something that was recorded the year before or 2 years before, but that was actually turned in by our district. And then there seems to be a big discrepancy for whatever reason. I mean, you named about 10 different reasons, but there is a date that they, I assume, you have to help with that because I really don't know the details, that there is a date that they have to be turned in each year, and that's pretty consistent. And the next year there were, or may be some changes. But again, we're talking quite a few, what was that top number that declined at 1,600?
So when the report came out in our accreditation report, it notes about approximately 2,200 students. And so we took that list of 2,200 students that were provided within the report. And that's when we, just our district, started looking at names and saying, well, we don't think this is a student we need to meet on. And so, again, we've pared that down to approximately 1,600 names, again, because there were duplicate names, for all the reasons I mentioned before. The systems where we record students in our, within our district and within the IMS system, as students move into the district, as students go on an IEP, those names are recorded into the system. So it's always an ongoing list. The same is true of students who move into our district. We're constantly putting them into the campus system. I can't speak to our universal polls, Dr. Tate, of when the state pulls all of our names of students, except maybe when we do our count in October. We do the special education count, which is when they do a huge pull as far as looking at our funding each year on the last Friday of October. But the system's in a constant state of flux because students are constantly moving in, moving out, coming on an IEP, going off of an IEP. So it's an active system all the time. So hopefully once we meet with our implementation advisor, we can get further clarification on just specifically how they pulled their list so we kind of know and have an idea of how that happened and where it started.
I guess what I'm questioning is our district and our numbers. I mean, if we are having such a discrepancy, and we're talking about 600 students, I mean, I understand maybe 10, 20, 50, but we're talking 600, that's a big difference in how we can miss the mark in 1 year by 600 students. Now, and we're turning that in, I assume that if you turned it in October, are we having that much of a turnover between October and the next count? Are we having 600 discrepancies that aren't actually, you know what I'm saying?
No, I know what you're saying.
Because you named it more than one reason why. And so, if we have a school, just say their population is, one elementary school, they say that it's 600 students, and the students coming and going all year long, and all of a sudden there's 300 students not there, then you would actually look at their accounting process and say, how are you accounting in and out as students each year or each day or each week that this is happening so you can keep up with the accuracy? I understand from October to October there can be a difference.
Yeah. Again, a number of the kids that we mentioned were what we call speech-only IEPs, so they're receiving just an AEA, what we call a support service, and so those students aren't receiving instructional services through the district. So that accounted for a large number of those kids. They were in their pool. And so those are the names, a lot of the names of the students we pulled out were kids who were on IEPs, but were only receiving speech services. So they were not receiving instructional services from the district. I'm speculating again, but a number of names on there were open enrolled students. And so those are students potentially that show up in our database as a Davenport district student, but they're open enrolled out of the district. So there were names on the list that were open enrolled as well. So again, once we meet with our implementation advisor, she should be able to help us figure out what exactly the pull was that they did and then getting us to the accurate pull.
The discrepancy is a great question. We need to solve it and find out, are they doing something different? Are we doing something different? Is it on our part that we're just not making the corrections? I mean, we need to find that out. So this is a good exercise for it. We don't know how, but let's find out and we'll get back to you.
At that time, will there be a breakdown of the different reasons for it? Meaning you attribute a lot of it to speech that should not have been in there, or whatever the reason is, will accompany explanation.
Yep, we'll figure that out.
Having been at the meeting between the DE and the district, I will tell you that the department wasn't willing to just in one conversation without data in front of them just take all those off. But the department was also not in disagreement with the district's stance on those students. And I'd probably throw one more thing out. It would probably be a mistake to think that the IMS system that is used across the state is the perfect resource, and that the issue is all somewhere else. The IMS service system has been in the process of being updated for a long period of time, and there are times when we as AEA systems have problems with the state IMS system too. So we look forward to that continuing to be updated and to be more accurate as well. So I think, you know, there will probably be a variety here, but most of it is going to be taken care of in the way that you've heard Patty talk about, and the DE was agreeable to that, but they're waiting to have the data in front of them.
Director Beck.
One very short question. Is this implementation advisor somebody who's done this kind of thing before? How confident are we that they're going to give us good direction?
You want to take it? Okay.
So we met her for the first time last week. She has a variety of experiences. She had worked at AEA, at some AEAs or an AEA in the state. She had worked at the State Department at one time. She's been out of state for the last 12 years, working for the Office of Special Ed, visiting a variety of states, actually helping special ed centers with these kinds of issues. She was, we felt pretty confident in her. She was actually pretty optimistic. She said that these are not uncommon mistakes that have been found across the nation, and that she thinks it's an opportunity for Davenport to actually become a model site for other districts in the state as well as the nation if we work together on this plan.
Dan, do you have anything?
No, I don't. I could barely hear any of it, so.
Oh, man. I apologize for that. I know it's just tough when you're on the other end and you can't hear very well. I don't know if
We don't have
there's...
to start over, do we?
Well, that's what I was just thinking about that. I don't know if there's anything we can do to facilitate it. I've got a couple questions, but I'm not going to ask them. I was looking at the time, and I really am glad everybody's here. Everybody. And this is a fantastically important issue, and I don't want to in any way minimize it. But I do want to point out to especially the board that at this rate we'll be here for about 6.5 hours. And that's true. Okay, I didn't do the math completely, but it's so I just want to point out that we have to be respectful in all ways, but we've got to ask the questions too. So I think that's the end of the first section. Is that correct, Superintendent Tate?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
We'll go to citation 2.
All right.
So I'm going to discuss citation 2, which is a discussion about excuse me, prior written notices that were provided to parents. And this citation directly correlates to citation number 1, so they're combined. Prior written notice is a form of the IEP. It's required to be presented to parents anytime there is a change in identification, evaluation, or placement of a student, and then how that provision of their free and appropriate public education would change based on that. So in this, they reviewed 165 IEPs, and I think it's important to note that too. They didn't review 2,200 IEPs. They reviewed 165, and then they extrapolated that from the IMS system just based on different metrics. And so of those 165, they did find that 88% of them had common language in it, kind of a cut and paste as opposed to having individualized student needs. So they feel that we need to, of course, you know, we're going to be convening the IEP team meeting for that. because we're going to, it's again tied to Citation 1, and we'll be working with the implementation advisor to create professional development for staff and administration. It is something that as a department that we had known was a weakness, and we had actually provided professional development to 4 of our buildings in small groups in April. Yeah, early, before we got this. So we knew it was an area that needed to be worked on, but we didn't feel this had a direct impact on students because it's simply a documentation issue that needs to be cleaned up. But that's a very brief overview of what the form is, so please, yes, feel free to ask any questions.
Excuse me 1 second. Are we completed with the presentation on that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, Director Beck.
One quick question. So if the prior written notice is an issue, how does that not impact students directly? Because parents then may not be getting the information that they need or should be getting?
So that's a great question, and so whenever we have an IEP meeting, and if the team determines that they're going to make any changes, it's like a notice to parents. So it's really it is a critically important document, and we also note that we were weak on this area and had already started having the conversations about the fact that we need to do a lot of professional development around how we're documenting on a prior written notice. We have lots of forms within an IEP, but this is a critical form because it really is the notice to parents of what the IEP team discussed. As Stacy said, anytime we look at the identification, evaluation, services, or placement for a student, we have to document that on a prior written notice, which is notice to parents about what changes the IEP team is proposing. In addition to that, what's also noted on the prior written notice is a date that those services are going to be implemented. So that allows parents an opportunity to consider those services and if they want to move forward with them or not. So it's probably, in my opinion, the most important piece of an IEP because it is the notice that parents get. The point that I think that Stacy was making was that when these prior written notices were completed, and I 100% understand why it was said this way because we presented it this way as a district when we talked about moving to an all means all model and really moving to a multi-tiered system of supports. Many of them, as she noted, said on there that this was a district initiative to move to a multi-tiered system of supports. Putting that on a prior written notice right away flags that this is not an individualized decision. And again, we failed to do that appropriately. We failed to document it appropriately on a prior written notice. So that's why we have been cited for the use of the prior written notices. So when we go back and convene those IEP meetings, we need to be very clear and very specific about what was discussed in those areas that I mentioned related to each individual student. And that's what needs to be documented on the prior written notice.
Anybody else? I didn't mean don't ask questions. Dan, do you have any questions? Well, then I will. This whole thing, Patty, and like this, the wording that you used was it was a district initiative that resulted in this. And I'm thinking a district initiative, all means all, doesn't mean that it is not individualized. I don't think. And so I'm wondering, in all the rules, and you and Kim, I think, have mentioned federal and state laws involved. And you kind of lumped them together when you both mentioned them earlier. And I thought, well, are they the same? I haven't looked at all the laws. And what I'm wondering here is whether do these codes have specific language and they say thou shalt not use the word district-wide or something like that? And do they provide guidance wording, and they say thou shalt use this kind of or this specific language in something like this? I'm just curious where those organizations are And where we are, how far do we have to go in vetting a word?
Sure, I'll take a stab. So as far as rules and regs, the feds set the rules and regs around through IDEA, the Individualized Disabilities Education Act. And so that's what sets the standard and the expectations nationwide for how we implement services for students with disabilities. And then each state has to align with those, but how they implement varies greatly. So for instance, not every state has a PWN or a prior written notice form. They accomplish that rule and that regulation in a different way through their documentation. So actual implementation varies by state. So that's kind of a general response to that. In regard to, we have what we call a procedures manual that the state, the DE, and the AEA statewide system has developed, and it's intended to provide guidance to IEP teams when they are documenting the entire IEP, the evaluation process, and everything that's required within that. So there's suggested guidance on how you could word things or approach things, but there is not, to my knowledge, anywhere that says, do not say district-wide. So the key with this whole citation is just around the idea that whenever we're making decisions for students, it needs to be on an individual basis. So when you document that, they want to be able to read that it's individualized. If they see something that gives them the hint that it's not, it raises a red flag. And so that's what they are kind of referring to through this process, is just ensure that the intent was good, as has been mentioned here a couple times, with this movement to access to general education curriculum. But how we describe that and document, we need to be careful that we're actually looking at each individual student when we're doing that. Does that help?
Well, and I understand it, and I apologize for sometimes resisting some of our government oversight. But in this case, to pick on a specific word that has nothing to do with the intent. The intent is to provide the individualized instruction, clearly. But the use of the word district-wide as it applies to a thought on what we're going to do, it just strikes me as wrong. And part of the wrongness, to me, gets to the whole issue of transparency. Now, we're hammered oftentimes for not being transparent. And if we use a word like that appears to indicate here's the facts, and now what I hear you saying is that the state is saying, too bad, you can't be transparent because that might connote something else that it really doesn't, unless you don't know how to read and understand a word. I'm just very, very frustrated with that. And I can't imagine, and maybe it's just, you just do whatever they say. Is that about it?
So we're going to meet with our implementation advisor. I know I keep saying that, but this truly is the case, who will help guide us through what the expectations are for how we need to address the citations within the accreditation report. What I will say again, though, and I think Kim did a great job of explaining the use of prior written notices, the key to an IEP in the first word in the I in IEP is individualized. And so what they're noting is we did not individualize our prior written notices in describing how we went about providing services for the students, which was the whole placement discussion before as well. We wrote that it was a district-wide initiative, which doesn't speak to individualization at all. And so we have to ensure that we're holding IEP meetings, looking at every student individually, and then documenting their individual needs and what we need to do for them on the prior written notice.
And I accept all that, and I understand it all. I just resist the idea that we can't speak the truth. So, with that, is there anything else? Director Mayfield.
I'm trying to understand what the citation was for. Is it because they found a lot of similar language across the board? And I'm talking about, you said they only used 165 are in that area to come to the conclusion that the language that was being used was similar. I assume that those that write these IEPs were given instruction. And in giving that instruction, sometimes we use the same language that we hear because it describes possibly whatever it is, regardless of who the individual is. But I would understand their concern when they see a lot of the same language. Because if it's individual, if each one of them have similar words or almost the same words, then you have a tendency to think that it's sort of been predetermined that that's how we're going to describe kids
Yes, you hit it on the head.
or individuals. So I guess the hard part is that thin line of when we're having that discussion with those that are writing it. Are they individualizing it enough? Are they using the tools that they've been given through conversation, which is similar? So it's not I can't determine from where I sit at the right way or the wrong way, but it brought notice from the state that they did not like when they see similar language across the board. And granted, you said it's 165, but if they got 165 more, would they find the same thing? So I just wanted to mention that because it wasn't quite clear to me.
No, you're absolutely right. And as Stacy noted before, we've recognized as well that documentation on prior written notices, even prior to this coming out, we know this is an issue. And it is a slippery slope because when we've caught ourselves in providing guidance, and we do a lot of IEP training. We do it yearly with staff, especially new staff who come in, but we recognize the fact that we need to do more. And so that's going to be a priority for us. And so we always run the slippery slope of if we've provided examples, sometimes when you provide examples, then that becomes the language you see in all of them. So we really have to ensure that when we provide the training, which we'll be doing for this, that we really talk about the authentic authoring of a prior written notice so that they are truly individualized and that we don't cookie cutter. That's a term I use. We don't cookie cutter every that a teacher doesn't become comfortable in cookie cuttering how they write prior written notices. So it's a good opportunity for us, which is how we're looking at it, to provide lots of training to our teachers on how to write IEPs and how to document the conversation that's occurred. You'll recall when we were here the last time and did a presentation, we talked about agendas for IEP meetings and that whole process. And so we're going to spend a lot of time providing lots of professional development to our teachers on this process. And I'll tell you, it's overwhelming. There's a lot to be done just to hold an IEP meeting and to write an IEP and to make sure we're doing everything correctly. But it's something that we know is a priority for us. We want to ensure we're providing all of the guidance for our teachers to do that.
Thank you.
Director Gosa decided to hang up. It is really hard to hear when you're in a hotel room and it's just difficult. So he'll catch up with us later. Is there any other discussion on this? How many IEPs are written in a year?
So we have approximately 2,500 students who are on IEPs, give or take. So that's a fluid number as well, depending on the time of year. So for sure, our teachers are writing 2,500 IEPs a year.
Okay.
But the number of teachers are writing more than that, simply because if they convene IEP meetings on a regular basis, they would be amending IEPs regularly. So there is a lot more that goes into just for services. Teachers write a lot of
Okay.
IEPs.
And that's kind of what
and they amend, when I say a lot of IEPs, I'm talking about writing an IEP, which we have an annual review every year. Sometimes in addition to that, in a particular year, you have what's called a 3-year reevaluation as well, which includes additional paperwork that has to be provided as part of the IEP. And then if IEP teams meet more than once a year, which many do, if there are concerns. Additional writing takes place to the current IEP as well.
So the thing that again just floors me is that what you said earlier, it sounds like, is that every IEP has to be written as original thought, meaning the person can't have any experience and can't use any of those words or ideas, because then it would be considered cookie cutter. And yet we know that all of us do that. We rely on our experience, we build on it, and I'm just stunned that we can't use our experience properly. Anyway, I don't even know if it needs a comment. If you want to, go ahead.
So, Director Johansson, I'd respectfully ask you to think about it a little bit differently, because it is the right district initiative. It really is, and you shouldn't feel like you need to go away from that thought. The idea is incumbent in the IEP process to take a district initiative and to make sure it's personalized. So if they pulled 165 IEPs and everybody had 45 minutes, then they're saying, well, this was dictated by the district initiative. But if they pulled 165 IEPs and they found this wide spectrum and there was not a pattern, that wouldn't have probably surfaced. And so it is the right thing. The district initiative is the right work. It's the right, I mean, this is a great thing for teachers to have a multi-tiered system of support that gives them support to serve the differentiated needs of students that are in their classroom that Director Mayfield was talking about earlier. It's a great thing. It's the right deal, but it still has to have that spectrum of serving kids according to their needs, not according to the district policy. So there is a middle ground, I think, in that thought process.
Okay, Stacy, were you going to say anything?
Well, not to discount, again, the individualization that needs to happen, but it might be important to note that in the IEP system for each box, and this is on all the goal pages and all the pages, but on the prior written notice box, for instance, there's the 5 questions. And a teacher has the opportunity to bank a statement in those boxes on any of the pages of the IEP, and then they just hit that little bank box, and then it automatically cuts and pastes what they've already put in there. The system was designed so that teachers had less paperwork to do, but sometimes that becomes a flaw in the system, because then we don't think to go back and, add the additional information for each student. So it's nobody's, it's just a systems issue that's, again, meant to make this process easier, but then does tend to drift into lack of individualization. So something we know we need to fix.
All right, thank you. Anything else? Okay, we'll move on.
Disproportionality is a serious issue, and it negatively affects the academic success of students. In education, it should be a prime focus for every board member, superintendent, administrator, principal, teacher, and employee. In Davenport, disproportionality is not a special education issue. It is a district issue. It is a state issue, and it is a national issue. It's serious, and I know that most people in this room understand the seriousness, but I have just 3 citations from the last few months. Education Week, May 1st, 2018. Black students continue to be disciplined at school at disproportionate rates when compared to their peers, even as U.S. schools issue fewer suspensions. These findings come after years of emphasis at the local, state, and federal levels on reducing the use of exclusionary discipline, such as suspensions and expulsions. Brookings Institute's report, January 18, 2018. Major racial disparities in student discipline rates have been documented for decades. Most recently, the 2013-14 Civil Rights Data Collection documented that black students, who make up 16% of enrollment, account for 40% of suspensions nationally. GAO highlights from a March 2018 what GAO found. Black students, boys, and students with disabilities were disproportionately disciplined in K-12 public schools, according to GAO analysis of the Department of Education National Civil Rights Data for the school year 2013-14. These disparities were widespread and persisted regardless of the type of disciplinary action, level of school poverty, or type of public school attended. By providing this information, I by no means want to minimize the issue. We have a nationwide challenge, we have a local challenge, and we have to meet it. The best practices for fighting disproportionality national, when you look at the research, are work on a cultural change within your district or your school, have a positive climate with supports, continue social and emotional learning such as Boys Town, training and professional development, clear expectations and consequences, positive interventions over student removal, data collection and responsive action. We have a lot of things going on in the school district which you know about and we've covered at committee of the whole meetings and reports we have from our schools. And I just want to go over these, starting with even this is not enough. We have student intervention teams in every one of our schools that meet weekly. We have our STARS mentoring system. We have the Greater Achievement Program for low achievers. We have wraparound programs for several of our schools. We have the positive behavior and intervention and supports as our district policy. We have Boys Town methodology in most of our schools. We have culturally responsive teaching and professional development for that. We have Dr. Adams, who has worked with us for over 6 years and does professional development in our schools and personal consultation. We have a poverty subcommittee. Each year we have the Martin Luther King Day for intermediate African American students. We have the Achievement Gap Committee. We changed our expulsion hearing format. We have advocates for hearings. We have clubs and activities exclusively for African American boys in elementary, intermediate, and high schools. Mid-City High School. Family involvement liaisons in 13 of our buildings. The community school model of Family Matters. Teaching and learning plan goals, which gather data to show over and underrepresentation of our subgroups. The board in every single one of our reports asks, let's see the data for the subgroups. We have an instructional alignment team. That's our team from the district with AEA personnel, and we have spent months looking at data to answer your question, what is the difference in student achievement? What's the achievement gap? And we're going to make a presentation to you. We have school administration managers in our schools to help alleviate so that the principal can spend time on leadership. All those things, but it's not enough. We have to do better, and this report continues to shine the light on us and the rest of the districts that have to work hard. We've got to overcome this. It is probably the biggest challenge of our time. Go ahead.
So as you can see by this particular slide, in the area of disproportionality, the state identified 3 specific areas that they consider us disproportionate in. The first one is identification, and what this talks about is identification for special education services, so students who become ineligible for special education. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and we're going to show you some information regarding the data that the state pulled and derived and noted in our report. They also talked about suspension and expulsion, and we're going to show you that data as well in relation to how they showed that we were disproportionate by subgroup, and then along with seclusion and restraint. So we'll get into each of these areas individually, and Gus will discuss each of the slides that we have available here.
So if you look at the graphs, not the graphs, the chart here, it speaks almost identically percentage-wise to a lot of the circumstances Dr. Tate was referring to that are both district-wide, statewide, nationwide. But as you can see, in Davenport, we're right around 15% of our total school population are identified as special education students, in other words, have an IEP. And then it's broken down there by the individual subgroups. Given the statistics of the 15%, those percents fall under the following characteristics of white, African American, Hispanic, and multiple races. The kind of interesting statistic thing there that we are anxiously awaiting discussion with the state about is how those percentages are calculated, because if you roughly add them together, they don't add up to 100%. And so my thought would be if your total percentage of around 15% of the school population has an IEP and those percents are from that, your whole would be that 15% group, and then your subcategories would add up to that 100% of the groups. But that's just a statistics problem that kind of really annoys me because I want to know how they did it. I was a math teacher formerly. That aside, the important fact here is that clearly, very similar to what Dr. Tate said, African American students are being identified as special education students and put on IEPs at an alarmingly higher percentage than those other subgroups. And like Dr. Tate said, our thought here is me personally, I know the department, I know I've heard Dr. Tate speak about it very passionately, is we're looking for all the resources we can find or means to curb this, because it is an issue, but it's not something that you can solve through a prior written notice, check or something like that. So, any questions on that first selection of data there? They get somewhat more convoluted as we go.
Anybody? Director Hayes.
Just for clarity, Dr. Tate, you stated 16% nationally, and it's 23.32% in our district?
Let me go back and look my data, because I was talking some was suspension, some restraints, so let me go back and look.
Okay. And secondly, I guess for Patty, you would probably be the best one to answer this, because you probably see most or all of the IEPs. I'm just kind of questioning for, I guess, for lack of a better term, some teachers may be afraid of aggressive young black males that come into a room and appear to act out, and rather than like a more empathetic move or providing that extra touch with respect, sometimes I'm wondering if that can be kind of misconstrued, that something is not quite right and an IEP is set up. Do you think there's any validation to that?
Well, I'm going to ask my AEA counterparts to help with the answer to this too. I think that you're asking a really good question, and I want to go back to some previous comments that were made by Mr. Decker and by Kim Hoffman and by Dr. Tate as well. When we talk about putting a multi-tiered system of supports in place, the intent is that if we have a good fluid system, and we are a district who is starting that process, and we're really working hard at ensuring that we're doing a good job with that system and ensuring we have all of the right factors in place. So once you have a good system in place, the thinking is then that fewer students, 80% of the kids should do very well in a general education setting with the additional supports in place that have been described here tonight. And then as you look at students who require more intensive services and get to the point where we're evaluating them for an IEP, that process, and I don't want to speak for the AEA, but it's a very lengthy process to really dig in and go through an evaluation to determine if a student requires special education services or not. One of the things that I think we'll start to do is to really ensure that we do have that multi-tiered system of supports in place. And if it's not being effectively implemented, then I think that's something that we'll be more cognizant about coming out and saying, well, we're not quite sure the student should go on an IEP. We may be missing some pieces here prior to moving to eligibility determination and saying that a student requires an IEP. So I think that those kinds of things are in place. In addition to that, I think that as a district, as we continue to focus on really ensuring that positive behavior intervention supports are in place in our buildings, and that we're doing the right kinds of things to really look at how to support all students, especially our African American students, I think that we will see that number that stands out right now for the identification of African American students goes down. One of the pieces I think that is going to be critical in what occurred at the meeting with the Department of Ed is they actually suggested an organization that we need to consider as a district and an AEA who have done a lot of extensive work, because one of our requirements, and when we get to that slide I'll talk about it, is that we're responsible for bringing in a national expert on disproportionality to help support us in looking at our African American students and how best to meet their needs. And so I think that that is a huge opportunity for us as a district to really dig into what do we need to ensure we have in place to meet the needs of all of our students. So we're looking forward to that, and I think that next week as we meet with our team from the Department of Ed, we'll start having those conversations.
Okay, thank you.
Let me go back to the statistic I quoted. Black students make up 16% of enrollment, but account for 40% of the suspensions nationally.
Okay.
And secondly, I want to address the question you asked that sometimes is uncomfortable to address. There's some teachers that don't feel comfortable with young people. There's some teachers that don't feel comfortable with middle school students. There's some teachers that don't feel comfortable with people of a different race. We're human beings, and we have to face that. And that's why we have unwrapped the culturally responsive teaching that we're talking about, asking those uncomfortable questions and seeing how do we respond. Everyone is different, and there are lessons about how you can approach people of different races. Every race has a different, whites act differently than Hispanics, than blacks, and we bring that into our schools. We have to accommodate to that, and we have to make everybody cognizant every single day of this difference, and we have to accommodate to our students. That's our challenge.
Yeah, I understand the Boys Town method that we've used. However, that last series that we just purchased from Cherokee, from the culturally relevant series, I think that was probably one of the best things that I've seen implemented so far. And once everyone catches on to that theory, hopefully it will become better. Because they're not only with the students, there are employees that are in those uncomfortable situations going to work every day. And I think it's just a district-wide systematic error that maybe not through any type of malicious infliction at all that is happening. It's just kind of a normal process, and a lot of people are feeling the wrath of that.
Director Beck.
Kind of piggybacking on that, I know the culturally responsive teaching, can you speak a little bit about how broadly that's been implemented and sort of where it's been implemented? And then I guess my other question would be, have we set clear targets? Like, I know some school districts identify a problem like this and say, okay, our goal is to reduce disproportionality or suspensions of this population of students that's disproportionate by 15% by next year or something like that, and they implement a program like culturally responsive teaching, roll it out across the district to everyone right away. Do we have anything like that that we're considering or doing already?
Yes, when Dr. Holly came, every teacher experienced that was in attendance that particular day, and we have kept the pressure on from that time. Every week I send out a tip from the books that he has written and things for teachers to try in their classroom, so they know I'm personally involved in that. And just day before yesterday, our instructional alignment team met, and we're looking at our teaching and learning plan. We're looking at future goals, and in every case, it's looking at overrepresentation or underrepresentation of our groups. So yes, we are. And it does have numbers assigned to it.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Director Mayfield.
I appreciate the good intent that we have, whether we're talking Davenport schools, parents that think they're doing the right thing at home, students who think they're doing the right thing. But the good intent does not always result in good results, as we know, because this has been an ongoing issue for quite some time. It didn't just happen a year ago or 10 years ago. You know, part of the easing of the pain that I've seen people in when they talk about anything racial is we compare it to what's going on nationally. That sort of softens the blow to us, that we don't feel so bad about what is happening in our district because it's happening everywhere else. But I think if the fire's in your house, then you should feel the pain a little bit more than the one that's in the next town. So I don't use that as a softening tool. Maybe we could learn something from it. But I know from being in our district for 40 years that it is not always the right thing that we do, but we do things with good intent. Now, maybe if that's what's important, that we do things with good intent, then it's okay if we fail. Because we've been trying a long time to change this disproportionality of minorities in our district in their achievement. I know a year ago, Dr. Tate sort of took it on his own to say that he did not see the results we wanted in our district. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, he said it's his fault. Well, I don't think it's one person's fault, because he can't be in every classroom. He can't be on every playground. But you know, the plan and the relationships, to me, is where we're failing at. A lot of our kids, and I've been told this, that by the time they're in third grade, we know which ones are going to prison. And it's not because they're going to prison just because of their behavior, but it has a lot more to do with their academics, whether they're achieving what they should achieve. Now, when we look at the disproportionality of our students, we were talking about 16% of those students might be minority or black or Hispanic, I'm not quite sure. But 40% of them are suspended. I want you to think about this for a second as to some of the cause of why this is happening. With good intent. I always want to say with good intent. If you look at our general population, even in Davenport, if you look at the incarceration in Davenport, you'll find a higher percentage of minorities that are going to jail than what represents them in our community. If you look at the prison population, you will find a higher percentage than those minorities represent. And, you know, we seem to, when I say a higher percentage, then we are in the population. It might be 60% in some areas of the prisoners that are in prison. But yet, they're a very low number, whether it's 15% or 16%. I'm concerned not just of what's going on in school, but the overall. But what I'm trying to show you more than anything else, it has to be more than just coincidence. Because there are more, you know, we work on all the time poverty here. And the impression, the moment you say poverty, it must be black folks. That's the impression most people get. But actually, there's far more poor white people than there is black folks. Just like in schools, there's far more white people here in our district than there is minorities. But yet, we're overrepresented in the negative areas. We have to look at ourselves and what we're doing, right or wrong. We can look around the country and see what's going on, but that does not change what we're doing here in Davenport. Achievement is one of the greatest factors in how kids are going to live the rest of their life. And if we do not do something innovative with that aspect, starting from the day they walk into schools to the day they graduate, if they graduate, because if we look at the kids that fall out of school, black males in 9th grade, way too high a proportion again. What are we doing or not doing that this continues to happen? And I think it's Einstein that says if we continue doing the same thing over and over and over. And believe me, I've witnessed this over 40 years. I'm not talking about the last year, and I'm not talking about the last 5 years. I've seen the same process, whole new program, same results. It has a lot more to do than the program. I always say it's the will that we have. And I'm not talking about a will of a certain number of people, the will of the community to make the, we have had very successful schools with minorities right here in our district. And instead of continuing them, they come to an end. And we don't even acknowledge the job that they did. I've witnessed that. So I have to look at it and say, do we have the will as a community to solve the problem? Or we say, well, the same problem's all over. So even though we're struggling and we're hurting, we've got plenty of company. You know, misery loves company. Look around you, it's everywhere. I've seen the success right here in the Davenport School District. And people that have been here for 40 or 50 years have seen it too, where minorities are out the top of achievement. Don't want to brag about a class that I've seen kids in first grade with 60 or 70% of them were minority kids solving for unknowns. They were doing algebra in first grade. But you know what? We didn't duplicate that anyplace else. Instead, the principal came down and said, you can't do that. Those kids would be too far ahead of all the other kids when they go, if they go to a different school. See, I think it's lack of will. Is it bad intent? No. Is it wanting to do harm to others? No. Do we think we're doing the right thing? Oh, of course we do, because we try. But it's the same result, unless at some point along the way that we look at those that have been successful and say, we're going to do that. So I hope we feel better having this discussion. But until we get to that point, that we have the will, and when I say we have the will, it is not just another new program, but programs that we've sit and watched in our community that were successful and then, for whatever reason, disappeared. So thank you for listening. I hope that we find the solution, but the solution is really the will, because all these things that we've talked about, we'll be back here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, talking about the same thing. And the most important thing to me is that we do something to draw students to Davenport schools. You know, we all rise with the tide. I don't care if it's the kids in special education or kids that are low achieving. If we don't find a way to help them rise with the tide, then we're all going to sink together. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Anybody else? I want to go back to Gus's question because you had asked if we had questions on the specific slide you were talking about, right? And that's where I wanted to go. If I understand it right, the top line says 15% of our total population is identified for special ed, and that's just a fact, right? Okay. And then you say percent of students with the following characteristics. So what I think you're saying is that white, 11.73% of whites are identified for special education. Is that correct?
Truthfully, we don't know. The verbiage and the writing that you're seeing up there is exactly what came back from the report.
I understand, but somehow, because then my next question really won't make sense if this doesn't make sense. Is what I'm thinking consistent with what you think that they thought when they wrote
What
this?
you just stated is what I feel they are trying to convey, but they did not explicitly show us the like they gave us, imagine you have a math problem, they gave us the answer and never showed the problem. And when we called to ask about that, we said, we'd like to know how you derived your percentages. They said at this time, we don't have our data, what's the word they used? Their data analysis specialist to tell you. So what you're seeing is what, I can literally see what's turning in your head, and I'm thinking the same thing. I am annoyed beyond belief that we were given an answer and not a calculation to see where that answer came from.
Right.
My assumption is the same as yours, that indicates that 11.73 is of the total white population, 11.73% has an IEP, but we don't know that we were not given a formula, for lack of a better term, to show that. And on the next slide, which, can we jump to the next one just because I want to make a big point here that relates to exactly what you're asking. If you look at these particular percents, they gave ranges for 4 out of the 8 areas using a less than sign, which is a range, and they didn't actually explicitly say the percent. Now, if you look, what's interesting, African American and more than 10 days of out-of-school suspension is denoted as 4.48%. That would fall into the category of less than 10. How do you, truthfully, I don't know how to delineate. Now, I'm going to make an assumption that we all have made, I think could all agree on. We're assuming that the other categories are significantly lower than 4.48, because why would you show it that way? But we were not given a formula to accurately determine how those were calculated.
Okay.
My first question, if I got to talk to this and the data person, would be, please give me the percentages that are less than 10% so that you could make a comparison to 4.48. Because as we were putting this together, we thought we would show it to you in the form of a pie chart or a graph, where you can't graph something that's a range against a fixed number. That's not possible.
Right, and that's what, I look at this and I say, I can't understand it. I can guess at what I think they're maybe saying.
That is correct.
But when you say, or they say, 11.73%, and then there has to be another number. Like, what percent are whites of the whole population?
Correct.
Right?
You'd need that comparative. You would need that comparative percentage.
So, and I'm trying to be really nice, but they've cited us for identification, but then they give us this kind of feedback, and we're supposed to base, I mean, you're going to get an advisor, I understand all that, but is there any way that we can ask them? You've tried. Can the board, I'm sure the board can ask.
I think at some point we're going to get clarity, but we just weren't given it directly. And when we inquired, it wasn't we assumed it would be a simple response, like, this is how we got those numbers, and it wasn't. It was, we need to consult our team. Then our team was, I maybe shouldn't say, but our team was not available. Our data person was not available at this time. As a math guy, it is super, super frustrating.
Is there any doubt, though, that there's a disproportionality? I
Well-
mean, because I understand what you're saying, and eventually we need to clear that up, but I think what we're seeing here is it's disproportionate, and we need work, and then we'll find out what percentage.
But I appreciate everything your opening comments on this, Superintendent Tate, but I think without the information, we can say it's probably disproportional, but we can't say if it's disproportional this much or this much, and I'm appalled at the lack of relevant information on this chart. I accept disproportionality is something we have to address, but if we were going to set a goal, as Director Beck alluded to earlier, I don't even know how you would set a goal here. You can't say, well, let's decrease disproportionality of whites. It wouldn't even make sense. So I'm just saying that somehow, and you're saying we're going to get clarity, and maybe we will, but this whole issue, if it's as important as you said it is, which you did, and I agree with, but then I believe too that the state better be willing to give us the right information. So, I apologize for my tone of voice.
No, I agree. And the frustration is that we've tried for a couple days to do that, and I think they've got one person that does this, and she was just not available. So we certainly will get the right numbers and get it out to everybody.
And I understand that too, but when was the report done? They did the audit in January, and when did we get the report?
Let me look here. No, it's right here. April 23rd is the date of it.
So
The report's
they-
dated April 23rd.
They would have had a few months for that person to get, at least in this one chart, 4 pieces of data that must be readily available.
Except we didn't question it till we were preparing these slides ourselves, and then we have our math guru who looked at it and said, that doesn't make sense. So it really,
Okay,
it was when
thank
we
you,
were putting it
Gus.
together, and we said, this doesn't make sense. We want to make sure we can give to the board and to the public
All right.
our best view. So
Okay, I apologize for taking time on that issue.
Okay, are we ready to move on?
Just so I'm clear, because I'm not, are we talking because the percentages don't add up to 100%?
No,
Are we talking the 11.73, that they didn't put any actual numbers there, so you know what that 11.3 represents as far as percentage of the total number?
actual numbers would have worked. There would be a number of ways that they could have represented the data in a meaningful manner. I believe that the way that they represented it is almost meaningless on this chart. That's what I'm saying.
But I think Dr. Tate mentioned something that's very important. We're out of proportion, and it may not be exact, and hopefully we can get some clarity there, but we're still going to be out of proportion. And that is the part that is most significant about the numbers. Maybe they're totally wrong, that the 11.73 and the 23, maybe they sort of switched them around. But it's some indication that we're doing something wrong, that we need to straighten that out to get the specific numbers, I understand. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we're way out of proportion there. And hopefully, we can get the clarity that you're asking for. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater here by saying it doesn't make any sense at all and doesn't have any significance. That's just my opinion. I know we differ there.
Well, and it appears that even our experts have said they don't understand. They're guessing at the meaning of this. I'm saying that without any sort of clarity, and we can say, and when you use the word way out of proportion, I think that it's important to have data. We ask for data, and I think when we ask for achievement data or anything else, if we're going to simply say we don't need the data, then it's totally different. So,
Okay, well, I hope we can get it cleared up, whether
Well,
this has any,
I certainly do too.
Okay.
But we're counting on the state to do it, right?
We'll get it.
Okay. You're going on to suspensions and expulsions?
Yes, so now Gus will explain the suspensions and expulsions.
It's less than 10 days of out-of-school suspension is what would be your middle column there. More than 10 days out-of-school suspension will be your column all the way to the right. This, again, is from the 2015 and 16 school years because it's dated back so that they have time to look at that whole year. And again, it's broken into those subgroups. Again, definitely the less than 10 days out-of-school suspension for the African-American population is considerably higher than the other subgroups. And in that middle column, to me, it shows that. The one that is concerning or that we'd like to definitely have some clarity on is the one all the way to the right, because it would be interesting to see just how far we are away from 4.48 compared to those other subcategories where we don't have that number. But like Director Mayfield said, I mean, there's no question in the middle column, less than 10 days out-of-school suspension, African-American students are considerably higher percentage than any other subgroup. I think, that definitely speaks to the statistics for sure. We just would like to know about the more than 10 days, because that's even more important, because more than 10 days out of school suspension, more days missed of instruction, et cetera. So, any questions about that one?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Director Beck.
I guess, so these tables were generated by the Department of Education as a summary?
Yes, they're actually noted. They're actually noted within the accreditation report. This data was pulled specifically from the report.
Because I think it's my understanding that there's some more detailed numbers in the report.
No, this is what was pulled from the report.
There's
from
going
the
to be
report.
there's another slide after this, but we pulled literally the exact numbers.
The language from the.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. There is one more though, one more slide. So maybe that's the numbers you were thinking.
Director DeSalvo.
So, Dr. Tate, can you explain the process of a suspension, both less than 10 days and more than 10 days?
You're talking about special education? If so, I'd rather refer to the experts.
Sure. So we have to. There's a few reasons why we have to look at the 10 days, and 10 days is a critically important number for us within special education. So students who are on an IEP can be they can be suspended for up to 10 days, and the common language that we talk about is the 10 free days, where none of their protections have to come into play. Once we reach the 11th day of a suspension, there are specific requirements that we have to do for the IEP. That includes conducting manifestation determinations, looking at, is there a pattern of previous suspensions? We have to look at the number of days from a cumulative perspective, but also look at, are there patterns of inappropriate behaviors that have led up to the total number of days of suspension, as we look at manifestation determinations, and do we have an appropriate IEP in place? So this data is tracked by the Department of Education, and they're specifically looking at out-of-school suspension data. Suspensions are also, there are a few different ways that suspensions are looked at. If it's in relation to a manifestation determination, if you even suspend a student for, let's say, a quarter of a day, a fourth of a day, when you're looking at the requirement of conducting a manifestation determination, that equates to a day. If you're looking at totaling up the number of days of suspension a student may have, that equates to a quarter of a day or half of a day. So there's lots of important information regarding suspensions and why they look at less than 10 days and more than 10 days, because we are required to ensure that we put certain parameters in place. But the even bigger conversation is 10 days of suspension from school. In our opinion, 10 days is a lot of days of suspension. And for students who exceed that, that's a large chunk of missing school for suspensions. So we really want to ensure that we're looking at this data to ensure that suspensions are, if they have to be issued, it's very judiciously how they're issued, and ensuring that we're looking at all options available to ensure that we're not just suspending kids.
So I wanted that clarification so a lot of people could understand that process, because it's, and we've talked about that before. My question is more, when a student is getting in trouble in school, who makes the determination we're going to suspend him a day, a half a day, a month? I mean, who makes that decision?
So that's a great question. So as a district, we have certain procedures in place to help guide administrators, building administrators, in looking, and that's for all kids, in looking at how many days should a child be suspended, or what's an appropriate consequence for a certain behavior that's exhibited. So we do have that district-wide. But the other step that we do have in place in relation to special education students, because it is so critical that we do ensure we're following the law, we have a specialist on staff, Mr. Long is his name, and principals call him, and they will have a conversation with him regarding what the situation is and what has happened, and they talk about what seems to be an appropriate length of, if a suspension needs to be warranted, what seems like an appropriate length of time to issue a suspension. And they work very well together in ensuring that we are providing the rights of all of our students in relation to suspensions. So they do contact Mr. Long to have those conversations.
My fear with these numbers, obviously they're frightening for a number of reasons, but I'm afraid we have to be very careful in the message we give to that staff, because are they turning a blind eye because they want to meet a number? Are they turning a blind eye because they don't want to meet a number? I have great concerns that we could have worse numbers yet if we don't. I don't even know how to address it. You know, we've got to be consistent, and we've got to make sure that no matter what the ethnic background of that student is, that we are consistent in how we are issuing discipline. And I'm not even sure how you tackle that, to be honest with you. It's quite frightening.
We're very cognizant of that, and I will tell you that Mr. Long, in collaboration with working with our administrators in the district, they're all very cognizant of that, and they do a great job of really looking at what warrants a suspension. You know, I think that the challenge that we have is really ensuring that we want to be consistent, and we want to make sure that all kids are treated fairly. I will tell you, suspensions are not issued lightly. You have to have pretty specific situations to warrant a suspension in our district, and so it's a big challenge. But I think that the administrators work incredibly hard to ensure that they're doing the best job they can in being consistent with that. And again, they work with Mr. Long as well to ensure that we are being fair and equitable to the best of our abilities.
Director Beck.
This sort of overlaps with our prior discussion on the numbers. I mean, why don't we just come up with our own numbers? And then we have the data. Like, why do we have to use the state's numbers? And I understand the state may come in and say, we don't trust your data, but it's coming from us, and we might have the details that we want, I guess is my question.
Yeah, we can easily do that. This is a report on what they gave us that we need to do, be honest and fair. And again, when we get our consultant next week, we'll ask and make sure, but certainly we can run our numbers. And it will show a disproportionality again. Yeah, so I don't want to keep, we're not going to escape that this is reality, but certainly we will and can and compare it as we have with the other lists we've compared.
Anybody else? Going to this chart then, the title is suspensions and expulsions, but the headings on the columns don't appear to include expulsions. So, so does that suggest that there are no expulsions?
I can't speak to that. We also kind of asked that same question. Does it suggest there were no expulsions of special ed students in the 15-16 school year? I believe, and I can't speak to this without pulling the data from that particular year, but we may have had an expulsion during that time, but I would want to speak to that and look at our data previously to ensure that I'm saying that correctly. I can't tell you right now whether we had none or not.
I just would think, since the state was preparing this, that they would have had a column that says expulsions, even if it's 0, if that's what they're highlighting here. The other thing, and I think we brought it up at one of the prior meetings, and I'm very concerned about the more than 10 days, because some of that may occur because of our processes. And we try really, really hard to observe that 10 days. But that goes to the notification of the parents, it goes to all the information where it has to go, all of this. And I don't even know how that is possibly tracked. I don't know that you have that information, because during an expulsion, when the expulsion request comes through, if we don't do our work in the right timely manner, and there are sometimes where we even get a request from the parent, we don't want to do it during this time. And so then we go past the 10 days, and the way I understand it is that unless we have like a written authorization, that still goes against us for the more than 10 days out of school suspension. So, like I say, I don't even know if that's possible to track it. I just think that it's too bad if process can cause bad statistics. I'll leave it at that. Any other discussion on this chart?
Okay, we'll move on to the last one, which is seclusion and restraint.
This is from our fall 2017, which was through November 7th. Again, it's broken down into the same four categories as previously, and it shows special education students versus general education students. Again, the obvious statistic there is that African American in both special education students and general education students are put into a seclusion setting or have to be restrained at a much higher percentage than the other subgroups.
Okay, any questions on this chart? Director DeSalvo.
Is it acceptable if I read from the memo that we received from Patty? The email where she commented on one of the things, or do I need to form it? I need to form it in a question.
Sorry, what?
Patty sent the board a memo on April 25th with comments. I'll just pose it in a question.
Okay.
In the media that came out after the audit was made public, there was discussion about chicken wire. Can you please comment on the chicken wire information under restraint?
Yes. That will come at a later time because that was a specific citation, and we're going to talk about that specifically. What this particular slide is referring to, this includes the number of students by race and looks at the percent by race of those that were either secluded or restrained. The comment about the chicken wire, that actually is its own separate citation. So we'll get to that one.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, any other questions on this chart? Okay.
Okay, so we will move, okay, we have a question. Okay.
Director Potts has a question.
So Gosa can hear me wherever he is. On this seclusion restraint chart, it gives us percentages, but it doesn't give us a hard number. Okay, so it's conceivable. Is it conceivable that it could be one or two students that have been the necessity to have been restrained multiple times, and then that each time is counted as an incident?
That is conceivable, yes.
Okay.
Okay. And when you conclude with this section, you're going to explain next steps, right?
Yes, we are.
And then after that, we're going to take a brief recess, and I'll probably allow about 10 minutes. And we do have restrooms on the third and the second floor. Go ahead, Patty.
Okay, so our next steps in working with this is a big citation for us, as Dr. Tate mentioned and as everybody is aware. And so, again, these are the next steps that have been identified by the Department of Education. I mentioned this before, we have to work with a national expert on disproportionality in special ed. They've provided us with their guidance on who they think would be a good fit for us. Next week when we hold our meeting with the Department of Ed, we'll be discussing that. The other thing is we talked about, if you think back to the first slide that we showed, which was on identification, one of the things we'll be required to do is work with Mississippi Bend AEA to review the student IEPs for our students of color, and we'll have to go through the process of conducting reevaluations to determine, again, if they continue to be eligible for special ed services or not. So that's going to be a lengthy process for us to do, and convening the IEP team again to have those conversations about if all students who've been identified on our list who are African American will continue to be eligible for special ed or not. So that's going to be a big thing for us to do. The other thing that the state mentioned in the report is they were questioning if we're documenting our suspensions adequately. Now, they referenced in the chart the information related to out-of-school suspensions. But the one thing that they also talked about in the accreditation report is we use, within our district, so across our district, we have rooms that have been identified in different buildings, and they all have different names. And students are sent there for different purposes. So it's kind of based on the different buildings and what they use those rooms for. And so the state noted that there seems to be some inconsistency. Number one, these names are, or these rooms are called lots of different things in lots of different buildings. Students are sent there for lots of different purposes, and they questioned if we are documenting in-school suspensions appropriately or not, or if we are meeting the requirements when a student is in a room of it not being documented as an in-school suspension. And they noted this not just for special ed, but for gen ed as well. And so the bullet here that says we need to determine if our suspensions are being adequately documented really pertains to that conversation that they noted in their report. And then, of course, I sound like a broken record when I say this again, but one of our requirements is to work with our implementation advisor to ensure that staff understand restraint and confinement regulations. We spent a great deal of time this past year. All special ed teachers received information regarding restraint and confinement. That was our opening day last year at our special ed in-service. We did work at length to train all of our administrators on the rules around this, but again, we will work to continue that professional development for all of our staff as well. So we'll work with our implementation advisor.
Director Beck.
One quick question. Do we also have a system in which we like notify parents when something like that happens? How does that work? And is
Yes. That's part of the law under Chapter 103 for restraint and confinement. There are specific requirements for notifying parents when you do restrain or end up secluding a student. So that's built right within the law, and we have a pretty good system in place for how we go about that.
But I guess then could some of the discrepancy be in terms of like if there's discrepancy in notification because the different people are using the rooms for different reasons? They may or may not feel like it warrants notification.
So there's a different, what the state was referring to is some buildings have diversity rooms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, not diversity rooms.
Diversion.
We've been talking about diversity. Okay, diversion rooms. And then some buildings have lots of different names for lots of different rooms. And so those aren't necessarily used for the purpose of restraint or confinement. They could be. So the important thing to recognize about restraint and confinement is it doesn't have to be just a specific location. You could restrain or confine a student in this room. It's about the intent and purpose of what's occurring in the room. And so that's where we just need to ensure that we are, if a student is being restrained or confined, that we're documenting it according to the law. But in addition to that, the state noted that they believe we may not be documenting in-school suspensions. So we have to make sure that if a student is in a specific location for a specific reason, if it meets the definition of what constitutes an in-school suspension, that we're documenting that accordingly. The state did note that our in-school suspension rates seem to be low. So we need to revisit that and ensure that we're meeting the requirements for in-school suspension as well. And that was not just special ed. I mean, it's related to special ed, but it's even a bigger conversation about the different rooms that we do use within our district and for what purposes.
Anybody else? Director Mayfield.
I think you hit upon something there that I would be very concerned about, but it would be nice to get some numbers. You say that it's not an in-school suspension, but by the state law or federal law or whatever, if a kid is excluded from and confined to a certain room, are we describing that as an in-school suspension? I'm not talking about because he's going to that room to get help, but because of behavior in one room that he's confined to another. I know a couple of high schools, and I can't say for all four, that if you have inappropriate behavior, you are sent to a room like a detention room, but it's during the day. And that's where you remain during that class period. I'm not sure if you remain there all day long. But how do we classify that? Is it an in-school suspension? And I think that's what the state is asking, or we don't define it. It's just that kid's out of class and he goes back to class, and we have no indication how many of those are happening. It could be the same kid, 4 different periods out of the day, or they could be different. But my question is, are we documenting that? And does that have to be turned into the state?
That's a great question, Clyde, and the answer is, the state is questioning if in-school suspensions are being documented appropriately. So when we work with our implementation advisor, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up revisiting again, what are the parameters around what constitutes an in-school suspension, and if these parameters are in place, then yes, it is an in-school suspension, and we have to ensure that it's being documented accordingly. But even bigger than that, and we've had some internal conversations about this, is getting a handle on what are all of the rooms we have, and what is the intent and purpose for those rooms and buildings to ensure that we have a consistent message of what we're doing within what the purpose of the room is, and ensuring that staff know that in certain situations, if these parameters are met, then it's an in-school suspension. So we just have to revisit all of that.
So at this point in time, we really have not defined it. Kids are being sent there, but we have not defined for ourselves. It more or less gets them out of the situation, out of the classroom.
Well, again, if we think about it in terms of our special education behavior programs, if a student is sent from the classroom that they would spend most of their time in, and we're going to get into that as part of a citation, they have full access to a special ed certified teacher if they are in a room to de-escalate, and that teacher is working directly with them. So that wouldn't constitute an in-school suspension. So we have to figure out what all of the rooms are in the district and how they're being used, and then ensure that we have that everybody's trained appropriately on what the right parameters are for what's happening in a room, whether it's an in-school suspension, whether it's not, and ensure that everybody understands that. That's what the state noted, that they wanted to make sure we were clear in the district about that.
So that's special ed you're talking about, but as you mentioned, general ed.
Right.
And I don't know if you can answer that. That's sort of out of the realm that you're dealing with. But it sounds like that we have students that are confined to a room that are general ed students. I don't know if Dr. Tate could even answer that, or he has someone else here that can. But are those kids actually, is it actually shown or turned into the state of any kind of in-school suspension? Or to the past, I should say, up to this point? Or they're even shown that they were out of the room in school suspension, or what? What's the terminology that's being used?
For general education,
this
you might
time?
get a referral. That is, they go from their classroom, they go talk to an assistant principal, or they might talk to an interventionist, and they go back to their classroom. So that's not in-school suspension. And we do have other rooms we call, by different names. You might go in and just think for a while. You might have someone that helps you de-escalate to get back in your classroom. So in-school suspension is if you're going to spend half a day or more in one specific room, and you're assigned and say you're going to stay there, and we do report it to the state, absolutely.
So we do have
Yes.
rooms that kids are actually confined to for half a day or more.
I wouldn't use the word confined. They're in-school suspension. I
Or
mean, the
in
door's
school-
not closed.
Yeah, maybe I'm
Yeah.
using the wrong
Yeah.
terminology.
Yeah,
In-school suspensions, okay,
that's for general education.
yes. Thank you.
Anything else?
So there's a
Oh.
piece that Dr. Tate asked that I speak about, and that in our meeting that we had with the DE, Davenport, and the AEA, they made reference of a recently a report that came out in February of this year that included research on disproportionality and cites that studies have been done in reducing disproportionality. And that's of interest to us as an AEA, because we need to make progress in this, not in Davenport alone, but across our AEA. And so I immediately talked to Dr. Tate about the fact that we were willing to step up and kind of dissect not only that regional education laboratory report that came out this year that was referenced by the DE, but actually even go beyond that to look at national models of places that are making a difference. And so that's something that I'm making a commitment to you. Clyde, I don't want us to be 5 years from now having the same conversation. I want to find places that are working, whether it's in the report that the DE referenced or whether it's in us looking for other examples that are working, and then come back and our collaborative relationship with the district has continued to grow, and I think we'll have great conversations about what we have found and what is appropriate to put in place, and how the AEA can support it and work well together with the district to make sure that we're not having those same conversations. So deeply committed to that work, and we're very anxious to make a difference, and so it's not the same conversation.
I guess I'm not intending to respond to what you said, Mr. Decker. I appreciate it. I appreciate the comments, Superintendent Tate, that you made earlier. But I will make a comment before we take a break. Excuse me. When I look at all of the things going on, I hold that a lot of these that the board is dealing with, and I'm talking about this and a number of other things, go to leadership. And I'm talking, when I talk about leadership, I'm talking the leadership of the board. And this disproportionality, as the superintendent identified, is perhaps the most important issue. And as Mr. Decker indicated, that it's going to even be one of his priorities and the whole AEA priorities. And so the reason I'm saying this is that it has caused me a lot of distress as I think about this, and I think about what's important for the board to be doing. We do a lot of things, and I would say that just thinking about it, I don't know that we've even had a discussion that has been led by the board on disproportionality. So I want the board to think really seriously about this issue, and what we need to do as a board to help in this in resolving this. So with that, we'll go ahead. We'll take I want to keep it quick. Let me ask the presenters, are any of you going to leave right now? Okay. Then what I would say is that we will reconvene in 10 minutes or less, according to that clock, so it'll be at 8:25 or less. And if all of the presenters and if all of the board is here, we may start before that. But go ahead and take a few minutes. Can't help it. Director Mayfield out there, we'd like to get started again. I don't, that's what I was just asking for. That's Director Mayfield I was asking for. Does anybody have a clue? We're running, excuse me? Okay, thank you to everybody. And although we have had some requests to try to divvy up this meeting, we're going to continue to finish this meeting. And so I just want to mention that and ask again that all of us respect all of the time that we have. This is very, very important, no question. And I'm not trying to discourage any of the board from asking questions. I'm just asking that we be careful and respectful as we ask the questions. All right, Superintendent Tate.
We'll go to citation 4.
Okay, so this citation talked about that they reviewed 37 functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans to determine the rigor of assessment and if we're writing appropriate behavior intervention plans based on those assessments. So a functional behavioral assessment is a process that's used to sort of determine the target behaviors or the most problematic behaviors of a student, to determine the factors that might be triggering those behaviors, to determine the factors that might be reinforcing or maintaining those behaviors, in a hopes of being able to determine what purpose or function the behavior serves. Then based on that assessment, a behavior intervention plan is developed, hoping to reduce the problem behaviors and help the student learn more appropriate behaviors to be successful behaviorally. It is part of the IEP. So as they reviewed those 37 functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans, they noted that some of the staff completing those were not appropriately trained. And so that was a concern. And how this could impact students is that it's possible that without the training, we may not have done an appropriate functional behavioral assessment and therefore not developed an appropriate plan to help the student turn their behavior around and to remediate the issue. So that's sort of the concern about it. Our next steps, of course, are to, in collaboration with the AEA, review all of the functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans to determine, one, if they were done adequately, if trained personnel did them, and if there are concerns, we need to reconvene the IEP team to address it, which could include a reevaluation, redoing the functional behavioral assessment. And we will be working, of course, with the implementation advisor to ensure that staff who complete functional behavioral assessments in the future are appropriately trained.
Is that it?
That's it.
Okay, questions? Director Beck.
So is it possible, forgive my ignorance, to have a behavior intervention plan and not be on an IEP, or is this specifically behavior intervention plans that are part of IEPs?
So the ones that were cited are part of IEPs. Certainly, people can have behavior intervention plans that are general ed, but this citation is specific to students with IEPs.
Okay, would it be out of the realm of possibility that if we have this problem with the people who are on IEPs, that we have the same problem with general ed students and their behavioral intervention plans?
It's possible.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else? Director DeSalvo.
What prompts a functional behavior assessment and a behavioral intervention plan?
So when a student, whether they are, it could be during an initial evaluation, that part of the reason why they're being evaluated is that the student engages in behavior that they've tried to remediate through Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, but have been unsuccessful. And as a result, the behavior can be disruptive to the environment, but also is impeding the student's ability to learn. So we want to fix that. It also can occur when a student might have an IEP for academic areas, but now we're seeing problem behaviors starting to rise or challenging behaviors occur, and we need to address that as well. So it can be either way.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right.
That was easy. That's good. All right. Okay, so then the citation 5 has to do with removals and suspensions again of students with disabilities. And this, Patty discussed a little bit earlier, in that the DE, as they reviewed our information, was concerned at the low rate of in-school suspensions that we're reporting, and based on some data they reviewed, so some of the data they reviewed actually came from our behavior programs, and they would be our crisis intervention or referral logs. So that was actual data, where a student, if a student is struggling in the classroom, in the special ed classroom, we try to de-escalate and then do some corrective teaching and keep the student there. But if the student's behavior continues to escalate and disrupt the learning environment, they might go to what we call a crisis intervention room, where we have another special education teacher and paraeducator who can work with the student on a one-on-one basis to then again work through the behavior and talk about what behaviors would be more appropriate in that situation. And so we turned those logs in, and they looked at those and didn't know from their perspective, they couldn't tell, were these referrals where the student just went and sat and nobody talked to them? Would that be considered an in-school suspension, or what was going on? They needed further clarification there. And then in their interviews with general ed teachers, special ed teachers, and administrators, then there was this discussion of all of these other rooms that were used for students, both general ed and special ed, and they became concerned that in at least some incidences, those might be in-school suspensions that we are not reporting. And so the impact is that while students were in those settings, if they were there for an extended time, they may not have received some of their special ed services. And our resolution to that, or next steps, are that we need to, again, one, review all of the IEPs for students in behavior programs who were placed in an outside of the classroom setting for one reason or another, to determine if, was it a teaching situation where the crisis interventionist was doing one-on-one teaching, or was it some other situation where they were not receiving instruction, and determine, did we report it correctly? And then we will work with the implementation advisor to provide professional development on the use of suspension, expulsion, alternative settings, etc., to make sure that it's clear for all of our staff so that we code things correctly. And then develop an appropriate procedure for reporting those suspensions. But this really had to do with the in-school suspension piece again.
Are there any questions? Director Mayfield.
So it sounds like that there are some students or incidents that were not coded correctly, or at least they questioned them.
Yes, absolutely.
So it
yes.
wasn't clear
Yes.
where those students were at as far as in-school suspensions or not.
Yes, that's exactly it. It was unclear, and they questioned whether we coded it correctly. At least some of the occurrences.
How does the district feel about that? I mean, that we did do it correctly, or we didn't? I don't know. I assumed if you were doing it, you did it because you thought that was the way to do it.
So I can speak.
But now that they've pointed it out.
Yeah. I can't speak to all of those other environments that are being used, all of those other rooms. I think that's why we were going to try to do some clarification. In terms of our behavior programs, where we use the Boys Town Specialized Classroom Management System, when a student is, and it's not a suspension, they're not sitting out in the hall, because that would be something different, but when a student is really struggling with their behavior within the special ed classroom, and the staff in the classroom has tried to work with that student, but now it's becoming an extended time, or it's escalating to where we're not sure we can keep the other kids safe, or we're interfering with their learning, then the student goes to another classroom where we have a special ed teacher, again, another special ed teacher and paraeducator, who then works with the student individually. So at least from my perspective, they're getting one-on-one instruction. Now, that's different than if a student is going someplace and sitting all day, and I think that's something as a district we want to clarify and get more information on, and we're kind of hoping the implementation advisor helps us with that.
So in those situations, it's usually a student and one or two others that are working with them, or there's more than one student,
There
4,
could
5,
be.
6, 7, but only one or two teachers or.
Yeah, it could be multiple students. The rooms aren't very big, so it could be 3 or 4 students in there with the teacher and paraeducator trying to work with those students to kind of get things, talk about their behavior, talk about the situation, and then really the goal is to get them back to class.
So
in
it doesn't-
that situation.
Doesn't have to be individual then, as far as a para or a teacher with one student. That's not necessarily the case.
Not always. Yeah, it kind of depends. In most cases, yeah, they're talking to the student privately one-on-one.
But with other students around.
Yeah, could be.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay, great. We'll move on.
So citation number 6 is in regard to evaluation procedures, including initial evaluations. And what the state looked at here is they had pulled 6 IEPs that they had reviewed, and they felt that based on the documentation that they looked at, that the AEA staff was not present at the initial eligibility meeting for this child to receive special education services or be not eligible. So in fact, myself or our early childhood special education coach sit in all the eligibility meetings for students in preschool. So it could be students that were on what we call an IFSP, an individualized family service plan, between the ages of birth to 3, and then they were transitioning. It's a different eligibility process. You don't just automatically get on an IEP. You have to go through an evaluation to determine that. So it could be those students, or it could be students that were in a partner preschool in one of our village sites that we were just doing an initial evaluation on. So we've never had a meeting. We've had 170 of these so far to date this year. So it's a heavy business. But we've never had a meeting without AEA present. So in fact, in looking at the documentation in these 6 instances, there were at least 3 AEA people and up to 5 present at that meeting. So the only thing I can find in the system is that there in 3 of those instances, a meeting notice was not created in the IMS system to show that their eligibility meeting was held. However, we had Outlook invites from the AEA, or Google invites from the AEA staff. We wouldn't, as a district, we don't have access to what they call the child find process in the IMS system, which is just where that evaluation report happens. We wouldn't even be able to possibly pull information on students until the AEA notified us of that. So we discussed this with the Department of Education last week, and they said that, that I understand it might have just been a paperwork error, so just to give us, just that we will give them their documentation, and that this citation would not need to go any further. Is that?
Director Beck.
Can you explain, so do initial evaluations only happen at preschool, or they only looked at preschool? Because I would think that they'd be happening anytime a student is struggling.
Absolutely. That's a great question. No, not at all. Just in this particular citation, they only noted students. They said it was students that were transitioning from Part C to Part B, which would have been students transitioning from birth to 3 to IEP. However, actually only one of those students, number 6, was a student that was transitioning. But no, and a special ed evaluation can happen at any time in a child's school career. Even if they're homeschooled.
Right.
And
And
AEA does the evaluation, and then they let us, as a district now, as an LEA, local education agency, know of that so that we can speak to program that we would have, where location would be part of the team decision. So they always let us know once they've evaluated a child at any level, and then we're involved from that.
Okay. Can I ask, one follow-up. So, is it, if a parent suspects a child has a disability, they can go to the teacher and talk to them? Or if a teacher suspects a child has a disability, they could contact the AEA? Either way?
Absolutely.
Okay. And would the parent have to sign off if a teacher suspects a disability, or can they do an evaluation of that child without the parent?
They have to have a parent signature to move forward with the evaluation.
Okay.
Definitely without parent consent.
Okay. Thank you.
Director DeSalvo.
So you said in the meeting, either a parent can notify a teacher or a teacher would notify AEA.
Yes, this would be prior to the evaluation process.
Right,
This is what we
right.
call child find or the disability suspect process.
Okay. And probably a little bit off of the citation, but I'm curious about the process. So can you go over that? So who's involved, who notifies who, how are the parents notified, what meetings take, I know there's a lot of questions, but can you describe that for us?
I can, and again, please Kim or Bill, step in at any time. I did work as an AA consultant prior to coming to Davenport, so I'll do my best. I don't think anything has changed in the last 4 years. So if, at any time, if it's a student that is preschool age, if a
Let's say
parent-
any age. Let's throw the preschool out the window. I get that, but I want to talk about a normal student in a classroom and something becomes suspect to someone.
Yep.
What do we do?
Yep, so you would contact the AA professional there, and of course, in all of our buildings, each elementary building, intermediate building, and high school building has AA consultants that are.
On site.
AA consultant psychologists that are.
Okay.
Yes, so that's a fair assumption.
Okay. Okay, good.
And so we would assume that the student has gone through the, the SIP process, or student intervention teams that we talked about before, and, the child things in gen ed, but it could be that the student just was diagnosed with a specific disability by a private professional, so then, we would bring that information and say, I have this documentation, can we move forward with an evaluation if that's what the team decides. It could be that the teacher has, if the child has been in intervention for a specific amount of time and isn't making progress, the teacher says, hey, we need to do something more, let's do an evaluation, and see. Of course, the parents there with that meeting. And it could be that the student has, had something, just like a life-changing circumstance, all of a sudden, it might be, we've had students that we have, one student just had a heart attack one day, so obviously that you speed up that report, evaluation process because of an extreme need. But there's a number of different things that could trigger the suspicion of disability. It could be the teacher, it could be the principal, it could be the parent, it could be the reading specialist or the reading coach, any of those people could make a referral.
So once it's suspected, then an evaluation is done, and who's involved in that evaluation?
If it is suspected, then yes, parents would have to sign consent to start an evaluation. So parents might choose not to do that. And the people involved in that evaluation are typically the AD staff. They collect the intervention data from teachers, get the activation,
I have one more question, and you mentioned a doctor referral. Do we ever tell a parent, we need a doctor's note to confirm that this situation exists?
No, not at all. On the contrary, we have had situations where a doctor will write a note, literally saying that this child needs special education services. So it doesn't mean that the child, excuse me, actually has a disability. We would go through a series of questions to determine. So diagnosis doesn't automatically mean that there is.
So you-
we would never ever tell parents that they have to get a diagnosis.
You would not. But one more question. So you led me then to another question then. So a parent now has a note that the doctor is saying there is a situation here. And there's times when we're disagreeing and saying, nah, I don't.
It just depends. It just depends on how the student is progressing in school. So there's 3 questions when you go through the disability suspect process. The first one is, does this child have a diagnosis? Okay, so if the child says yes, then if you answer yes to any of the 3 questions, you move forward with the application.
Okay.
Okay, so if we have proper documentation, this note that I talked about earlier, doesn't have to do it with a little handwritten note, you know, kind of like on a prescription pad. That doesn't happen very often. That was an isolated.
Okay.
I'm just saying, and that's an example. The second question is the student in an intervention and is not progressing as expected, even though there's no other reason to exclude suspicion. And the third question would be, the student is making progress, but the interventions have been so intensive and so significant that the rate of progress is still different from their peers.
Okay.
Again, if any of those criteria is a yes, then we would move forward with the evaluation.
Thank you.
And it's a business policy. I think we've worked with AEA to say too, if the parent requested the application, we wouldn't deny that. We would not.
All right. Any other questions? All right, Patty.
Director DeSalvo, this one is reflective on your question you had earlier. So the site, no, not a problem at all. Not a problem at all. Wait time. It was never a skill of mine whenever I was a teacher, but wait time.
Okay, thank you.
Not a problem. So citation 7 was seclusion restraint as applied to students' disabilities. What the specific citation was the site team, in other words, the team from the Department of Ed came and observed that 2 rooms used for seclusion had, quote, chicken wire installed on the ceilings to cover the ceilings. How did it impact students? The intent of this protective mesh covering, which heavier wall material and also clear plastic panels over the light fixtures and over the ventilation ducts, light fixture bulbs, etc., were to keep students from potentially harming themselves. Really, it works out well to look directly above where you're sitting. If you were potentially a student who was in a very elevated behavioral situation and you wanted attention from adults, and you had your shoes, for example, and there was nothing else in the room for you to cause a disruption with, it's a student can and has and would take their shoes and try to break, and this has truly happened on different occasions, try to break the light fixture so that it breaks the glass, breaks the long halogen tubes. You don't have glass on the floor. You now have a dangerous situation. Likewise, there are students that would take their shoes or even jump if they were tall enough, and physically fit enough, where they were trying to smack the the sprinkler systems, breaking that small, I think it's mercury filled or something filled bulb so that it sets off the water system. So how are we going to remedy this? We're going to work with the Department of Ed to make sure we're in compliance and correct all deficiencies, but truthfully, we want to discuss with them what should we be doing, because we felt as though covering those things up with metal mesh, not in the sense of like building a chicken wire or chicken coop, and that language is, of course, very offensive, but in the sense of trying to protect it, what should we be doing? Because in some of our rooms, we realized that you couldn't have typical drywall as the wall surface, because I shouldn't give this example, but I've thrown my brother when I was a little kid through drywall, rough housing in the basement. We realized that wasn't safe because kids realized that that was something they could break through. So we went to using plywood in certain rooms, and of course we painted it, put same color paint, same color coating as what you'd have on your classrooms. Even in a lot of cases, at one particular building, they put motivational sayings on the wall, quotes from different authors and things. Likewise, we realized that the foam panels, which are very similar to what are in a lot of our schools here, those foam panels are actually just resting on a bracket system, kind of like you have in your basement if you have a drop ceiling. And we realized, well, those are, and again, a hazard. There's one particular instance where a student did a pull-up, broke one of those panels out, and was in the upper tier of the ceiling system. Bruce has told this story a couple times from that these things happen. So we tried to proactively take care of these while still maintaining a safe environment, which is outlined in Chapter 103, still maintaining that it had ventilation. Of course, we didn't want to do anything with the fire extinguisher system or cover that up with anything that wouldn't allow water to go through it, because that's not only violating every fire code in the world, but it's super important that it's there for a reason. Likewise, every door utilizes the handle system, where an adult has to hold the handle for it to actuate the door to be held shut, meaning that if an adult lets go, the handle is spring-loaded and actually spring-loads itself open. It'd be the opposite of like your door handles that you typically have that are spring-loaded to shut. These require someone's hand to be on them, so that if something did happen, or I don't know, if the teacher passed out, and they were the only person there, their hand wouldn't be holding the door, therefore the door would open. So we felt as though this citation, we're absolutely, next steps are working with the DE to comply whatever they see fit. But in a lot of ways, the team, myself, even as we met last week as a whole group, we didn't feel as though we weren't in the best interest of the student in this case, because we did this not as a means of building. I mean, this wasn't like you walk in and the whole thing was chicken wire the whole way around, as it kind of was portrayed in maybe in the media. This was, those exact type of vents, you can really imagine if they're only a 7-foot typical ceiling and I'm a 6-foot tall high school boy who's in a very elevated situation, and I am really upset trying to get out for whatever reason because I'm trying to engage in an altercation with another student, I'm going to jump up and rip that down because it's going to get your reaction from an adult, and our means was protecting that. I think what we went to in a lot of cases, we're putting plexiglass over the light fixtures, because that was still allowed for it to be clear, still allowed for adequate light. But where we couldn't do that with other things is if you put plexiglass above the vents or above the sprinkler system, you now have negated how they work. So truthfully, I'm excited that the state's going to give us guidance, because I'd like to know what we could do to still maintain that safety in this circumstance. So any other questions related to that?
Gus, talk more about then. What kind of wire was it? If it's not chicken wire, what kind of wire is it?
It would be like the mesh coating that would be similar to what you'd put over a window or a door window in a gymnasium. Likewise, it would be the same metal covering that you'd have in a gym, in every gym in probably our schools. Bruce is shaking his head, that would cover like your sprinkler systems. It looked like a basket. Those types of things where it's, again, I can understand their thought would be, well, a kid could potentially grab that with their fingers, and maybe that's their thought of why it would be unsafe. But you can't cover those up with something that's flush, like plexiglass or a wood panel, because then it doesn't allow the water to come down. So truthfully, we don't have an answer as to what else we could have done. We felt as though we were maintaining, our goal among these, no matter what, was to maintain safety. And it wasn't as simple as just putting a drop ceiling in that was false, made out of wood or something like that, because it takes away the ventilation and the water, which are outlined in Chapter 103, that say you have to have proper ventilation. It has to look like other rooms, as far as you can't have a room that doesn't have a vent or doesn't have of course, you'd never put a kid in a room that didn't have a sprinkler system or a fire system. That's kind of where we're at with this one. I would assume they're going to say some kind of plastic plexi cover, and then I'm going to ask what's the fire code about drilling holes in that for water to come through or something like that.
Anytime you hear of restraint as a parent, it just frightens me to death. So I guess to the administration, I would like more information, and this finding isn't about this, but what causes us to put a child in restraint? How long are they left there? Who's with them? I would like more information on that, and at a later time, but I would like to understand that process. What leads up to that? Are we tracking how many kids are in there? How long they're in there? Who's, I just, a little more information of the process would be very helpful.
Could I speak to some of that?
Absolutely.
Light on and off. So as far as tracking it goes, starting with the beginning of this school year, and we had kind of discussed this at the committee of the whole that we had previously, we use an online system that tracks the student, age, building, teacher, all adults that were involved, antecedents. It's a pretty lengthy computer-based survey system, and then it kicks back a report both to the district level and to the person that filled it out. The other thing that speaks to one of the things you mentioned earlier about how are parents notified of that is that system prompts you to say on the system who is the person that contacted the parents via phone or verbal contact within 24 hours, and actually explicitly makes you fill that field in with a name and a date. Likewise, it has a field that's filled in that says who sent the mailing within 72 hours, because both those are required. So it tracks who is accountable to talk with the parent, either on the phone or leave a message. And if you can't get them on the phone and they don't pick their student up after school, you would denote, that you had to leave a voicemail, but then you automatically send to the address and campus the date, the person who sent that, so that communication is there as well. And that is all outlined in Chapter 103. We mimicked our system straight from the Department of Education's Chapter 103 guidelines as far as what we're collecting, how the parents are notified, parameters in which the rooms are used, like I said, with the have to look like other classrooms, have to be painted adequately, ventilation, all those types of things. And as I think we discussed in the earlier committee, the whole meeting, we try to exceed those because it was determined by the Department of Education legal counsel that the room only had to be 8 foot by 8 foot by 6 foot to meet the parameters of a confinement space. None of ours are that small. In fact, I had the same reaction as you are there, kind of thinking,
I'm not a poker person. I can't play poker.
yeah,
My face.
that's just not appropriate. But it's also important to note that confinement in the sense of a room isn't always the room specifically.
Right.
We have a number of circumstances where keeping two students separated is a dire situation because of violence of those two getting into an altercation. So you have to restrain a child and maybe keep them corralled into a corner, so to speak. Well, that's confinement because they can't egress from that setting. And that gets documented as well. And as far as the directive to get this out to the teachers, we presented to every special education teacher at the beginning of the year, every administrator, and then the buildings that have larger behavior programming had specific targeted professional development. So they wanted all their staff right down to the janitorial staff to hear exactly what the parameters are, in those particular buildings. And as kind of a real positive with this that I know that we are proud of as a district is we had a specialist from Florida come whose speciality is behavior, and he commended us that our system is on the forefront of what is available. In fact, he told us we should be marketing this to try to get it to other districts and turn a profit, which isn't my point. My point is that we followed the Chapter 103 to a T, and this chicken wire citation isn't the sense we built a cage. It's we truly looked at how can you have a setting where a student's going to be in there, keep them as safe as possible, and not allow them to harm themselves with light bulbs, with sprinkler systems, with the ceiling panels, with ventilation ducts. And the scariest one of those, of course, was the lights. I mean, because those halogen tubes, you can break them by flicking them with your finger, and then you've got huge pieces of glass, and of course, they're going to fall right on the student. So our next steps, like I said, is to see what the Department of Education says specifically as far as how they would design the rooms differently. But in our particular case, I don't know what else we had at our disposal, truthfully.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Anybody else? Director Hayes is going to be leaving us. She's got something else that she has to attend to. But thank you for being here, Director Hayes. Okay, well, I guess then we'll move on to Citation 8.
This is the last citation, and this was a financial audit that the Department of Ed did conduct. They did an extensive audit and provided us with a lot of detailed information. What they found within the audit, they basically focused on 3 things that they said that we need to rectify. In looking at the staffing as it was allocated at Keystone Academy, they indicated that we may have improperly coded staff according to which funds they would come out of for their salaries. And so the citation specifically was around the fact that many staff at Keystone Academy were coded all to special education funds, and they noted that that needed to be split out between the general fund and special ed funds. And so that'll be something that we will get recoded and taken care of. And then the other thing they noted as far as the financial impact or the financial audit went was that we have a lot of vendor contracts that go out if we have tuition out contracts with other districts where we're providing services for students, that many of those were signed by ours have to be signed by the board president, and then the other district's board president or designee needs to sign the contract as well. And so what they noted is that sometimes those contracts were signed by one or both parties after the indicated start date of whatever that service was. So whether it was the student started on this date or whatever, sometimes those contracts were signed after that fact. And so we have to fix that. We said there is no impact to students with this. We'll have a specific list of names of the staff members who've been coded incorrectly that we need to fix, and then we'll be looking at our policies and procedures for how we're getting contracts signed to ensure that we're meeting the requirements that the Department of Ed expects. And those were the two citations out of the financial side.
Any questions? I have just a brief one on that last part on the signing of the contracts. And when you mentioned policies, are you thinking about the policies in your group or the policies that we have to sign all that?
No, I'm talking about procedures that we would put in place to ensure that we're tracking if we send contracts out, that we're getting them back in a timely fashion, or that if we need to secure vendors, that we're doing it as quickly as we can. So that it's more in line with start dates. It's a little bit of a challenge sometimes because sometimes we don't get them back right away from folks. But we just have to put our own procedures in place for how we're going to ensure that we're putting a checks and balances to make sure we're getting our contracts back.
All right.
I'm sorry, I have a question. You can
Director
finish.
DeSalvo.
All right, okay. The district payroll system, I'm struggling to understand how someone could be not designated to the right position. Like, what payroll system are we on?
So, in a nutshell, at Keystone Academy, we had a number of staff members that were just funded fully out of special ed dollars. And when the state came in to visit, they said, nope, you can't do that because those teachers at Keystone Academy are also working with general education students as well, simply because of the makeup of the classes. So that's why they came back and said, you now have to split fund those. So they'll be partially funded out of special ed, partially funded out of general fund dollars.
So in the payroll system, when they're entering their time, allocating, like, where I work, we have staff that are working on a project, you have to designate, I'm doing this now, so it goes to here. Is there such a thing, or?
So they've indicated specifically that 60% will be coded out of special ed, and then 40% needs to be coded out of general fund dollars.
And that was the state that said that?
The state decided
Got
that.
it. Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Is that proportion fair?
I think it's as fair as it can be, yes.
Is that a constant then forever and ever? Is it always going to be 60-40, or is it reevaluated every year? It just seems like an odd thing to say, well, that's it, without understanding really how much work goes each way.
I think it's fair right now because of how we have the Keystone Academy designed and how services are delivered to students.
All right. Any other questions? Director Mayfield.
It says vendor contracts. Could you give me more examples? Are we just talking about the teachers when you're talking vendor, or who are you talking about?
No, what we're referring to would be contracts if we need to hire individualized nurse. So it could be contracts for nursing agencies. It could be contracts for out-of-district. It could be other districts. We provide services for a lot of students who are residents of other districts, that they're placed in our district boundaries, so we provide the services. So it could be a tuition out contract. They specifically noted that in the report. It could be tuition out contracts. So we're sending a contract to another school district and asking them to sign off because we're providing services. So it could be a vendor specifically, such as a nursing agency, or it could be another district.
Okay.
Any of those.
–
Did you have more?
No,
Director
that would be
Mayfield?
it. That's
Okay.
it.
All right, any other questions on this issue? All right, your last slide says questions.
Yeah, I think we've asked a lot of those.
And I guess we're about ready to wrap it up. Are there any other questions that the board has when we have this group of experts that hasn't been asked? Anything, Director DeSalvo?
I'm curious about your involvement in day-to-day operations. I mean, I'm looking at administration up here, and I know Dr. Tate's in schools every single day, number of schools, but at trying to regulate and now really looking at these programs in depth, how much time are you spending now out there with the staff and these students and parents? And do you see that will increase?
So our department is out in buildings daily. I can't say that I'm always out in buildings because we have other responsibilities we're taking care of. Sometimes we end up in a lot of different types of meetings regarding special ed. But our department folks are out in buildings on almost a daily basis, working in buildings with teams attending IEP meetings. I attend IEP meetings as needed. We don't attend IEP meetings on a regular basis. That's not just part of what we do. We only attend if we think it's going to be a challenging situation, and we help facilitate those if we're asked to be part of those meetings. So we don't make that a practice because we want IEP teams to operate independently. But as far as being out in buildings, the specialists are there to support the staff on a regular basis, and so they spend a great deal of time out in the building supporting teachers. So we do a lot of that. We'll be doing lots of professional development this next year with special ed, so we'll be in front of our special ed teachers quite a bit.
Okay. So to the teachers, do you feel like we are giving them all that they need from us to support these students?
I think that we can always give more, and I don't know that I could ever say we're giving them everything they need. I think that professional development needs to be ongoing, and we need to just prioritize that it's going to become something that we spend a lot of time doing with our special ed teachers. I will tell you, every summer we do a ton of voluntary training with our special ed teachers, so we offer lots of professional development that they can choose to come to. We keep our summer very full of that.
Good.
So we try to keep the impact less during the school year and do more in the summer as much as we can. With the audit, we'll be doing more probably during the school year.
Okay. Thank you.
Director Beck?
2 questions. So you said voluntary professional development. Are there situations where it would be mandatory? Like, this is kind of a lot of this is big oversweeping, overarching changes, and I would expect everyone would be required to be retrained or at least, sort of be involved in some sort of discussion.
So summer's voluntary because teachers are off contract.
Right.
But during the school year, yeah, we'll have lots of required training.
Okay. And then my other question is sort of just a general one. Have we ever done sort of like I know the results can be variable, but like a customer style survey, like a Survey Monkey, where we just send a survey out to all parents in the district and ask questions about, are you happy with special ed services? Are you happy with your general ed services? This kind of thing, that kind of thing. I know if you ask open-ended questions, nobody has time to read through 10,000 different answers, but there are programs that'll run an algorithm, right, and look for key phrases and things like that. I'm just wondering if, as we implement some of these changes, it might not be a good idea to make sure that we're getting feedback from as many people as possible to make sure that, the changes we're making are doing what we think they're doing. And I'm trying to make it as, so you don't go have meetings with everybody, because that's not necessarily feasible, and oftentimes not everybody's invited or something like that. But just, a survey, sure, it's a little bit self-selecting, but that way you can kind of automate some of this and see if there's any big patterns of things we're doing really well or things not.
We're in the process of developing one of those to go out to parents.
Anything else? Director Mayfield?
Going back a little bit that we did cover, But I would be concerned for the future of the overrepresentation of minorities or blacks, whatever it may be. As far as in special education, and probably my interest goes bigger than just special education. I hope we as a district are able to talk about it a little bit more. But I'd be interested in the plan that special education has. And I know you spoke about a specialist that will be coming to assist. We don't know what that specialist brings to the table at this time. But I hope that it's something that the board is fully involved in, some parts of the community, because I would like to be informed prior to having just cemented a plan as to what the possibilities are. I think it just helps a lot. And I would like to think that the rest of the board would like to know, not just me. And again, I think that's just wanting to know that we're doing something a little bit different that has bared results in other places. So I thank you for what you do. It's a very difficult job. I don't take it lightly. I know it's not easy. You're working with people, and unfortunately, people are unpredictable sometimes as to how they're going to react to what you're doing. You're doing the best you can, but as always, we always want better. So thank you.
Director Beck.
Sorry, just one more comment. I just want to say I appreciate that this is, this wasn't the best audit result that we could have, but I see it as a really good opportunity to turn Davenport into a model of special education and hopefully changing the disproportionality we see across the nation, unfortunately. So I look forward to seeing a lot of good things come out of this. I see it as a good opportunity, and I appreciate you guys spending so much time with us tonight and answering all of our questions. We really appreciate it.
Director DeSalvo.
And I would concur with Director Beck and Director Mayfield that I know that this took a lot of time, and we've all been taking a lot of heat. Clearly, we have issues here, and I think this is a big step in the right direction. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we have to acknowledge that. And I think continuing to listen to the people that are impacted the most is going to be very key to making this successful, because we can sit up here and talk about these problems, but I think getting a real understanding is very important too. So I do appreciate the time, and I appreciate what you did with all of this for us tonight to tell us your plan. And immediately we had information from you about, you gave us the good high-level cliff notes that helped us weed through that 200 and some page document. So I do appreciate that too. So thank you for your time. Keep us informed. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we are here to support you and help you and make this better, because it will get better. Thank you.
Anything else? All right. Before we close, I just want to ask if there are any closing comments. Anybody, especially Patty, Superintendent Tate, Mr. Decker? Nothing? All right, then I'll just make a couple of comments and we'll adjourn. I wanted to thank all of everybody in this room and those that were here and had to leave earlier. And on behalf of the board, I wanted to thank especially the parents that we have here, our other visitors, community members, our administration, staff, our board secretary who's been here this whole time, taking notes. I appreciate the manner in which this was presented, and on behalf of the board, the critical work that you all are doing. It is really important, and we probably only understand a little bit of the difficulty. I want to thank our presenters, Kim and Gus and Susan and Patty and Stacy, Mr. Decker and Superintendent Tate, for everything that you've done tonight So, again, thank you all. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.